Okay. And Kate, let me turn it over to you. Okay. Okay, Kate. So, welcome first and foremost to Kate Winkler Dawson. Kate, thank you so much for being with us today. We so appreciate this.
Well, thank you for having me. I really appreciate it. I love supporting the
Absolutely.
libraries, so this is great.
And Kate, you are a UT person, which we'll get to in just a second as well. But
Mhm.
I want to turn it over to you, if you don't mind, to introduce yourself, because I don't want to tell your story.
Sure. I'll try to make it somewhat brief. I grew up here in Austin. My father was a law professor at the University of Texas for about 37 years. So if you're an attorney or married to an attorney and had a professor with the last name Dawson, it was my father. And that's really where my interest in true crime and really historical true crime started, because my dad was really into forensics. He started the criminal defense clinic at the law school, and he was very passionate about people who were wrongfully convicted. When I went on to become a journalist, I ended up, of course, like most journalists, on a lot of crime stories. I was at CBS in New York, and I was in San Francisco and London and Boston. And all of those places I covered stories that were everything from school shootings to the murder of Chandra Levy, if you all remember that, with Gary Condit. And
Absolutely.
and that was the only thing. I was in Modesto, California, covering that case, and the only thing that got me out of it, unfortunately, was September 11th. That's what ended up getting all of the networks out of there. I've been there for several months, but we could talk about that later. So,
Oh my gosh. Yeah.
yeah,
Thinking of those timelines, I'd completely forgotten about that because I
yeah,
was roughly in the Baltimore area at that time. So we had the legislative intern connection,
yeah.
and then moving right over into the Pentagon connection with all of that. Yeah,
Yeah,
sorry.
so if you don't know, Sandra Levy was an intern at the Capitol. She was from California, and she had apparently been having an affair with Gary Condit, who was a congressman, a very powerful Central California congressman. He was married with children, and she went missing, and he clammed up and didn't want to talk about it. His wife was at home dying of brain cancer, essentially, and he, they never pressed charges. It ruined his political career because he wouldn't talk about it. He wasn't open about it. And then, come to find out a couple of years ago, she was actually the victim of a serial killer who had killed several people and buried them in the park in Washington, D.C., close to where she went jogging. So I
Okay,
don't,
you've just broken that news to me, Kate.
yeah.
I realized I had completely forgotten about that, and I did not realize
Yeah.
that connection. Oh my goodness. Okay.
That's why you need to realize that admitting to an affair is much more important than than being a murder suspect. And it really did just sort of ruin him. Anyway, so I was in
Wow.
Modesto for quite a long time covering that story, and was with Chandra Levy's parents for an awful long time. So, all of that really built up to my career. I was a network television producer, but I also made documentaries. And I moved back to Austin in 2005. My dad had lung cancer, and I came back to be with him at the very end, and I just never went back to New York. So I started teaching at UT like my dad did, but I was in the journalism school. And when before he died, he asked that I get involved with the Innocence Project, which he started at UT a few years before he died.
Oh,
And I did.
wow.
And I did. I was on the board, and I co-taught a law school class, teaching attorneys essentially how to talk to prisoners and talk to lay witnesses. And this, of course, just sort of deepened my interest in crime and forensics. And then I wanted to pursue documentaries when I became full-time faculty at UT, but I ended up with twins, and it is difficult to be a parent and fly all over the world to do documentaries. Of course, now I fly all over the world to do podcasts, but it's easier. I have a lot more control with podcasts than I do with documentaries. And so I started writing books, and a friend of mine just said, if you want to do something that you're able to do at 3 o'clock in the morning after you put your babies to sleep, why don't you consider writing books? So I wrote my first book, which was called Death in the Air. And it was about the Great Smog of 1952 in London, which if you are a woman over the age of 40, you have probably seen The Crown, at least the first season. And the smog was depicted in The Crown completely incorrectly. But the story was how the British government contributed to the murder of 12,000 people because of the smog and how that happened. And there are all these real life characters, real people, like a doctor and a little girl whose dad ends up dying from the smog. But one of the characters is a serial killer who kills his wife a few days after the smog lifts because of a friend of mine, as a friend of mine said during one of my introductions, there's no more bad news a serial killer could get than you're stuck inside the house with your wife for 5 days during a deadly smog when he didn't want to be there. So she ended up dead under the floorboards. And so this was, I bring this up just because it's probably another question, Erica, you'll have is this shift from, how I go from the first book to the second book, which is American Sherlock. And the first book, Death in the Air, was about one large event told through the lens of a lot of different people. Like I said, a cop, doctor, this little girl, the serial killer, all of these people who had to struggle through this smog, someone with the government. So I wanted the next book to be sort of the reverse. I wanted multiple stories told through the lens of just one person. And my dad and I always talked about forensics. I think that he knew better than anyone I knew about junk science, good science, bad science, and really how we think that most forensic tools are not junk science, but they're not reliable. And that was a big surprise for me with this story. So when I found Oscar Heinrich, who was a forensic scientist who worked in the 1920s, really he worked from about 1910 until he died in 53. He solved or closed more than 2,000 cases during that time period. And then he just dropped off the map. Nobody knew anything about him. He doesn't even have a Wikipedia page. He might now after the book came out, but I don't think so.
I'm in library school right now. One of my projects that I'm going to do is update his wiki page.
Oh, great.
Related to your book. So thank you for the extra credit that I plan to be getting, Kate.
Well, good. He was unusual. I have this sort of checklist of things that I look for in a good book and what am willing to pitch to my editors. And one of them is a time period that I really like. So I loved 1950s London. 1950s London is sort of a unexplored area. It's not Beatles, it's not the war, it's sort of no man's land in between. And it's depressing, as my friends say. I remember a friend of mine, we were watching The Crown together, and when you look at 1950s, in buildings in London, everybody was burning coal. So there's smoke everywhere. And so, you see all these images of Queen Elizabeth walking through the palace, and it's real dirty, there's like black everywhere, all over, soot everywhere. And a friend of mine said, man, it really looks dirty. And I said, yes, there was this thing called a smog, and the coal, I wrote a book about it, you could read it. Everybody was burning coal. So I loved that time period, and I lived in London, and I go to London every year to teach a documentary course for 6 weeks. And I take my family. So, I'm a big fan of London, and I'm a huge fan of 1920s Berkeley, California, which is where Oscar Heinrich in American Sherlock is settled. And that time period, I go from basically 1921-ish to 1933. And so, think about those eras. Think about what happened. You have prohibition where crime rate skyrockets. You've got then the roaring 20s where everybody's giving away money. And then, of course, you have the Depression after that. So there's a lot of kind of high emotions and a lot of really rich characters during that time period. So that's one of the things that I really look for is the time periods, and am I going to enjoy writing about those?
And so I've got on the screen some screenshots of your 2 books and your podcast, Tenfold More Wicked, which we'll get to in just a second. So, and just again to let everybody know, I'm sure you can find these at your local libraries. We've got multiple copies of both of these. I listened to American Sherlock, which Kate also narrates, which is quite fun to have that specific perspective of the author. So we've got them. Be sure to check them out. Now, so you briefly touched upon, but let's go ahead, if you don't mind, and jump into American Sherlock
Sure.
and Oscar Heinrich. You mentioned the Berkeley connection.
Mhm.
Now, how did you decide which of his cases you wanted to showcase?
It's a good question because there were so many. This was an example, and I'm sure Erica, since you're in library systems, you'll appreciate this next comment. I have never been more grateful for an archivist than I was in this situation because, the story went that I found him mentioned in a book about a very famous train robbery that we could talk about in a little bit, and I saw the moniker America's Sherlock Holmes. And then the first thing I did was, if any of you guys are researchers, is I jumped to worldcat.org. And when you plug in somebody's name, then, with the little quotations around it, Edward Oscar Heinrich, up pops if he has an archive. And he did. He had a collection at UC Berkeley, but it was closed because it was more than 100 boxes and it was so large that they didn't want to open it. So it sat there for 65 years. And nobody had petitioned to say, this guy needs to have a book written about him. And I did. And I said, I need access to this. And the assistant archivist said, good luck. It's not going to happen. We are just like everybody else. We're understaffed and we're underfunded and this is going to take forever. And if you want this book written in 2 years, it's not going to happen. So she blew me off. And then the lead archivist, the head archivist, Laura Michaels, actually called me and said, I'll do it. It's going to take a long time, but I will do box and box out, for as long as it takes. I'll spend a day at the warehouse. So UC Berkeley, like I'm sure anywhere else, has a climate controlled warehouse where all of their raw collections are that haven't been cataloged, that just sort of live there. So she starts looking through all of these cases. And she said, I'm assuming you want only the violent ones. And I said, yes, you've assumed correctly. I only want the violent cases. So then she said, well, how do you want to do this? Because now I have pulled out 500 or so really violent cases. Oscar was a really good handwriting expert, as reliable as I will tell you handwriting expertise is. It's not, just so you know. And he was an expert. And so many of his cases, like he was hired by a father to prove that his 7th grade son had forged a report card. So he made money off of that. So these are all things that are in his case files because he for sure had OCD. Like there's no getting around that. I know I have a touch of OCD. So when I saw this archive and I saw what he kept and the way he kept it and how meticulous it was a little overwhelming, but it was perfect for somebody like me because I was able to go in and find these cases. So the archivist said, what cases do you want? And I said, and I hate admitting this, but I said, what are your thickest?
Yeah.
And I said, what's the most material that you have? And luckily these were cases, generally speaking, they were big cases like the David Lamson case that I could pull from other, like at Stanford University. It was a case of it's in the book, it's the beginning and the end of the book, of a woman who was either killed or had a fatal accident and her husband went on trial. And all the pictures in the papers were at UC Berkeley, or were at Stanford, as well as Oscar's notes at UC Berkeley. So we were able to piece it together, but this was such a challenge, when you talk about why women like true crime, I think I agree with everything that you've said. And I also think that women really gravitate towards strong narrative stories. Men do too. So I teach a sports documentary course also at UT. And I always think about that. How did these two intersect, sports and crime, true crime? Why do I like both as far as storytelling vehicles? And I think this is why women, one of the major reasons women do like true crime, it's because true crime, just like sports, it's a beginning and a middle and an end. It is a perfect 3-act structure. Something happens, somebody is changed, there is a conclusion, usually. I hate unsolved cases. So my cases always have conclusions, whether they're right or not. So sports is the same way. You play the game, you set the stakes at the beginning of the story. Why do we care if team X wins? Well, if they don't win, everybody's going to lose scholarships. Okay, now I care. And then by the end of the story, there's a conclusion. And they either win or they didn't. And with true crime, I think it's very much the same. And that's why I love true crime stories, is it's sort of like being dropped in a sci-fi world that you hope to never be involved in. But the characters are usually really interesting and tragic and problematic. And I think women are really attracted, to those stories. So
I think an intersection of those two things as well, at least why I am attracted to certain sports documentaries myself, like all of 30 for 30, for example.
right.
It's the humanistic way that we come to understand the story
Yeah.
and the people.
Yeah. So the founder or the creator of 60 Minutes, Don Hewitt, I think was his name, said, "I don't care about subjects. I care about the people who care about those subjects." So someone asked me one time, my books are pretty heavy in science, like air pollution and forensics. And the next one is that I'm writing, that I'm finishing up right now, is, psychiatry and alienists and stuff in the 19th century. And somebody asked me, how do you make science interesting? And I said, well, I write about serial killers. It's already interesting. I'm already rounding third base because people are interested in true crime. And so, with my books, I really try to, my agent always calls it like giving the medicine with the honey, and the serial killer and the crime is the honey, but then you get a lot of science and a lot of history and a lot of context. And one of the things that my agent always asks me when I pitch a book is, why do people care about this now? Why are you writing about this now? And a lot of books, I don't think, do that. So picking these crimes was really difficult because, coming back to narrative structure, I had to figure out not only where these cases were in history, why they were important. I had to figure out the little narrative structure within Fatty Arbuckle's chapter. Okay, where is his story and where is his victim's story? She wasn't really his victim, but where is Virginia Rapay's story, and how does that fit into this one chapter? Then how does Oscar insert himself into the story? And then where is this case in the grand scheme of Oscar's life? So you have all of these different narratives happening at the same time. And on top of that, I wanted to make sure that as we were working through time, you were understanding how he changed. For me, that's so important with the character. By 1921, people were asking me, why was he called to Fatty Arbuckle's suite hotel suite at the St. Francis Hotel 2 weeks after this woman had supposedly been murdered during one of his parties? Why did that happen? And I said, because he was at the beginning of his career. Nobody was sure that he actually offered any value. So he was brought in very late into cases. In some places, he wasn't able to do anything. But you see, by the end of his career, it's like he's there practically before people are even murdered, because his value has been recognized. So keeping an eye on the narrative flow, not only within his personal life and his professional life, and then within each of these stories, was like this murder map matrix for me. It was very complicated.
Well, and speaking of this concept of value and how his perceived value changed over time, you have some really interesting insights here and some really interesting history that I was not aware of, where we focus on what he was trying to change in terms of police training methods.
Right.
And one of his, kind of cohorts at the time, one of his close friends, they were really dedicated to my mind, an incredibly high bar of training. So
Yep.
if you look at that and you look at the times that changed just within his lifetime and then now, what do you think he would make of what we consider the standard of training to be?
Well, I mean, Oscar had very low expectations for anybody who wasn't him or who wasn't August Vollmer, who I think you're probably talking about. August Vollmer was the rock star of police. He believed that He was a police chief in Berkeley, California in the 20s. And Vollmer really believed that all police officers needed to have a college education. And Oscar believed, one of his famous quotes was that it would be better to have a chessboard in a police department than a mystery book, because he felt very strongly that highly intelligent detectives, which he didn't think were very many out there at the time, would solve cases. So, I think what Erica's saying that's really true is people ask me, what was he known for? What did he invent that we use now? And there are a few things, but really the non-sexy, glamorous answer was he taught investigators of all types, and then eventually lay people, how to collect evidence and how to process evidence and different forensic tools, that because he was a professor at UC Berkeley for so long in criminology, he affected that many people. Like I like to think I do teaching at UT with journalism students, the amount of people that you affect when you are teaching these techniques is astronomical when they go on to teach other people, or they influence people at their jobs. And Oscar was really good at that. I think that he would be enamored with the forensics and maybe somewhat with the training now. I don't think that at the beginning of forensics in America, everything seemed to be incredible. I will say though that I found it amusing that I think probably everybody knows that lie detectors are not admissible in court, and there's a reason for it. So every time I see a 48 hours mystery or on something on ID where the cops give the lie detector, it's useless. It really doesn't measure anything. It can't discern whether you're nervous or guilty. And even in the 20s, they knew that. The judges would not allow lie detectors into court. And Oscar still believed they believed in all of this stuff. All of these new techniques seemed infallible. And I think now he would be a little horrified, I would guess, to know that fingerprinting is not particularly accurate in a lot of cases, that shoe footprints, anything that's pattern matching is
bite
suspect.
Marks now.
Bite marks especially. But, I have such a conflict with certain forensics. Like everybody knows Ted Bundy was guilty. They needed to get him on something. And you remember what they got him on? It's bite mark evidence.
Okay.
Because he had apparently really bad teeth. And they said that he had a unique bite. But you can't, you're not going to be able to you can't get the accuracy with bite mark evidence. I mean, there are people in prison in Texas also because a dog sniffed them and detected that they were suspects. So I think Oscar, maybe he would have doubled down and said, if I conducted all of these tests, they would have been accurate. But I think that he probably would have been a little surprised about especially with the 2009 National Academy of Sciences report that just dismantled almost all of forensics and just said there's problems with all of it. You cannot depend on one of these tools, even DNA evidence. You cannot depend on it to secure a conviction.
It's so interesting to me, and I would put myself in this camp that does now consider, and you hear this on all this ID stuff, if the DNA is there, we, I think, are inclined generally as a mass to say, okay, I've heard enough.
Right.
Let's do it. But it's terrifying to think, okay, well, no, it's not 100%. Tracy just mentioned in the chat, hair analysis has run into problems, touch DNA, all kinds of things that we're questioning now.
So there's a show on, I don't know if you guys have seen, you should see it if you haven't, called Cold Justice. Have you seen it with Kelly Siegler? I love that show.
I personally have.
So y'all will remember this, right? You'll remember her little thing. And I actually wish I had more pens. I don't think I have any more. So she does this thing where she talks about circumstantial cases. I'm sorry, I'm getting my pens here. She talks about circumstantial cases versus a DNA. So she says, if you've got DNA and that's the only thing you have, you've got this one pen, right? A good defense attorney is going to find a problem at that lab that ran that DNA and be able to have reasonable doubt inserted. If this is the only thing, if this is all you have, but if you've got phone records, if you've got Cell phone records, if you've got even a shaky witness, if you've got, letters or something, all of the circumstantial stuff, you can't break it. And she says that she would much rather have a circumstantial case than one that hinges totally on DNA, or especially a confession, or especially a witness, because confessions and witnesses are wholly unreliable generally, especially if they're involved in a trauma, like a sexual assault or something, that it's just unreliable. So it's hard because I'll do these talks. I'm sure I sound like a Debbie Downer on everything that has to do with forensics, but it needs to be scrutinized better. And that's why we have Daubert hearings. That's why we have the ability for defense attorneys and prosecutors to challenge evidence.
And hopefully only for the continuation of the science, as opposed to, we're not saying eliminate the science, just
Right.
continue to make it better.
Right.
Well, and speaking of the one thing that Heinrich had said about the whole, don't need the mystery in the police barracks, but let's get some chess. So he has this moniker of America's Sherlock, but he is very clear that he really doesn't think much of the actual character Sherlock Holmes. Why do you think that is? As lay people, we tend to think of that as the highest bar of deductive reasoning and, all of that.
Well, I think that he gives mixed messages. I think he loved the moniker. I think he responded to that journalist in a sort of snide way when the journalist said, compared him to Sherlock Holmes. And he said, what he says is, I am not Sherlock Holmes. I don't work on hunches. I work on, the science and the facts. He did work on hunches. So I think that part of it was that he really liked to be above even sort of the greatest detective ever, Sherlock Holmes. But also, I don't know if you remember this part of the book where he's on trial, he's testifying in Fatty Arbuckle's manslaughter case, the actor who went on trial for manslaughter because a woman was found dead in his suite during a party. And he supposedly introduced himself and his female assistant as Sherlock and Watson to this police officer. And I absolutely believe that. I think that he really did get a kick out of the comparison, but I do think he also got a little bit sort of snotty in some ways. So it was interesting. I think he enjoyed it more than anything else.
To use to his purposes when he needs to.
Yeah.
I guess. Yeah.
How could you not be flattered by that comparison?
I know.
You'd have to be.
Well, speaking of forensics, speaking of changing times, speaking of Austin, we've got a question from the chat. We're curious to see, because you're involved with the Innocence Project, what you think about the Rodney Reed case.
Oh gosh, that is a can of worms. I mean, it's heartbreaking to me. I think it's really, really interesting. I think it's one of those cases where if there's doubt, it shouldn't be a capital case. I mean, if there's any doubt, and even doing this is obviously plenty of doubt. So I think it's disturbing. And, I am not. I'm certainly not interested in debating whether Rodney Reed was guilty or is guilty or not guilty. But I think it's interesting just or really even about the death penalty. But I think it is a good reason to think on a case per case basis whether or not the death penalty is appropriate, because going through all of this now has been so incredible. But at the same time, it's the passion that people feel to try to save him has been really wonderful to see, and really just, electrifying. It's pretty incredible.
And so just off topic, a little bit for a second, because I'm curious, what do you find your work to be in the Innocence Project these days? Or outside of you, what is the time, how is the time spent, would you say, for the people involved?
Well, the Innocence Project, I can't teach. I'm not teaching that class anymore. They just got too big, and there were too many law school students. So I have been on the board of the Innocence Project, and I could be a media advisor if they need it. The reality is is that for as long as we've been around, which was 2003, we've had two overturned convictions because of the clinic. And that was a really great case. I wish my dad had been around, frankly, when that happened. It was two men.
I wish, yeah.
Yeah, it was two men who went to prison for 12 years for murder and sexual assault, and they were innocent. And they came out and became, fairly productive people. And it was something that took years, literally years to do. And, they at the clinic have been working on cases for years. And a lot of it is having the money to get the new DNA testing. Are there samples available? And you have certainly, I've read so many letters from prisoners who are interested in putting forth their case. And it's difficult. I was telling students this, you read these letters, and one of the questions on the questionnaire that we've sent is there DNA available in your case? And a lot of them reply back sort of vehemently, no, there's no DNA. They got me in here on no DNA. And what's sad is that is not good news, because in order to have an exoneration, generally, at least through these innocence clinics, you need new evidence that was available or wasn't available, that wasn't utilized somehow. And so a lot of these cases are happening because there's DNA that either the testing wasn't good enough then, or it wasn't available, or it was suppressed for some reason. So I think that what they do at the clinic and in all the clinics is just such incredible work, but it's so slow. It depends on the jurisdiction and who you're dealing with in the prosecutor's office. Is it Williamson County? Is it Travis County? And how willing they are to work with you.
Because I guess or maybe I should just speak for myself. I always would hope that it's just this beautiful process that's very fast and everyone's interested in righting wrongs, and this golden light's going to appear and everything will be fine.
No, I think that things happen. For instance, the first Black district attorney in Dallas County, when he took over, and I can't remember what year it was, he immediately ordered DNA run in, I think it was 200 cases of people of color who had been convicted of presumably a lot of sexual assaults, and something like 15 to 20% came back incorrect. So I think frequently when you have someone coming in, and particularly because apparently I don't know this for sure, but that the DA before this other DA came in had a bad reputation for getting convictions for men, particularly men of color. When you have somebody who's coming in and wants to make a change or sort of throw things back in the face of the person who came before them, I think you see that. But if you have someone in place for decades, many of them don't want to admit that they've made mistakes. Mm-hmm. So it is very difficult in certain counties to make headway.
And certainly in Austin, we had the instance of the medical examiner coming forward to say possibly had memory issues for who knows how long.
Right. And that brings you back again to relying on one piece of evidence, especially in a capital case where the death penalty is on the table, or like a murder case, and just having this one piece of evidence. It's really scary. It's scary if you're on the other side of it, if your family member is the one who's looking at life in prison or the death penalty based on one piece of evidence. It's scary. So
now back to the book for just a second. You mentioned Aileen Lamson's case. That ended up being my favorite because I hate you. You made me wait until the end for the resolution, which wasn't totally a resolution. We don't truly know. But do you have a favorite case? And was it in the book, or did it not make it into the book?
I let me think. I have two.
I think Kate froze up for just a second. Sorry, everybody. It looks like just a little brief technical glitch. And I know that Kate just dropped off the call officially, so hopefully she'll come back in just a minute. But while we're waiting, any other questions that you have, please go ahead and put in the chat. Thank you, everybody who has so far. Sir Night Night, thank you, Rachel. Thank you, Tracy. Yep, so if you've got any questions while we're waiting, it's good. It looks like Kate's right back.
Hey, do you see me?
Hi there. Yes.
Sorry, I'm on my phone. I'll try to stay steady.
Oh, sorry about that. So we were
So-
talking about favorite cases.
Oh, yeah. So now, of course, I can't share my screen. I think one of them probably was the case of Bessie Ferguson, which is sort of smack in the middle of the book. And it's kind of gross, but you're all here because you like true crime. So Oscar was sent in the mail a piece of scalp with an ear attached. And they said, the police said in El Cerrito said, we don't know where the rest of the body is. We have no idea. And it was pretty much like, we need to find out who this person is. The cops didn't even know if this was a male or a female. How he died, how the person died, where the body was located. It was kind of a mess. And so I think it's my favorite case because he is able to use one thing that he found on those body parts, which was a grain of sand. And because he was a sanitary engineer in Spokane, Washington for a very long time, he was able to use this test that he used to figure out the dirt sediment, what it was made of. It's a particular type of microscope that uses a prism to break apart the different components of a piece of sand, for instance. So he was able to take this piece of sand and run this test and figure out where that sand was and where it would be consistently. And then he started looking at how round the grains were, that he figured out this would come from kind of a slow moving stream, and that it had salt deposits on it, but not big enough to be sand like on Port Aransas. It would be more like inland sand, maybe that a river had connected to the ocean because there were such small deposits on it. So anyway, he gets out this map and draws a circle, and it's like a 5-mile circle, and they start looking and they find her body exactly where they thought it was, which was 12 miles from where the body parts were found. So, and then I think that, the story doesn't end there. You find out a lot about Bessie Ferguson, and she's quite complicated. And, whether or not, I won't spoil whether or not he finds out who killed her or not, but it was a case that was, I think, difficult for him. And I think that, I found that to be a really interesting case. Just from a perspective of it just seemed next to impossible. And this was illustrative of what his skill set was, which was nobody else would have had that test. No one else would have been able to figure that test out, really. And he was, because he had a professional background. So he had a degree from chemistry from UC Berkeley. He went to Berkeley as a student with no high school degree because his dad died very tragically and he had to drop out of high school. And he became a pharmacist when he was 18, and he wanted to go to college, but he didn't want to go back and get a high school degree. And so he essentially talked his way into UC Berkeley, and he got a degree in chemistry, and he went on to become a chemical engineer. And like I said, a sanitation engineer, like all of this stuff, all of these different things that he did. He became a chief of police in Boulder without having any experience. All of these components put together made him an excellent forensic scientist. His first job at a pharmacy taught him about toxicology and about handwriting analysis, because he had to decipher all of the prescriptions sent by the doctors. So I think it's interesting when he pulls tools out of his toolkit that nobody else has, just because he has this great background.
And when you go into the level of detail with everything that he did learn, some of which was self-taught, or
Mhm.
coming from just available resources at the time, um, you would think that he was 100 years old. No, this was all packed into this
Yeah,
young person starting out.
yeah. I think, it was a friend of mine I was talking to about Oscar and what his capabilities were. I talked to you about the fact that he was OCD, and I just don't throw that out flippantly, because
Yeah, you're not making a joke of that either. I mean,
no,
it's true.
it's true. And he really, and it's interesting because, sorry, my computer's restarting. It's interesting because one of my kids was diagnosed with OCD, and that is when I was able to see it. I could see the parallels between her and him. So Oscar, because of his father's death, which was he died by suicide, related to financial problems, Oscar had a fixation on finances for his entire life. So when I walked into UC Berkeley and saw this archive of his, there were probably 50 different leather-bound journals where he had recorded literally, y'all, every cent that he spent for essentially from the time he was about 15 until he died. He recorded every little thing, and he journaled and wrote every single detail of his day. He put when he smoked a pipe, what time that was. He even, I joke in the book, he even wrote, I found 8 p.m. journaling. So he was journaling when he journaled. And to have that level of anxiety, because it got worse as he got older, just these stacks and stacks of financial records that were overwhelming. And it didn't seem to help because he was constantly on the brink of bankruptcy. He was funding 2 sons and their education, and like their trips through the Mediterranean, and one of them went to Oxford, and he was financing one of them until he died and lost God. So, I see the anxiety, which is OCD is tied into, it's a type of anxiety. And, I remember talking to a psychiatrist about it, about one of our kids. And she said, OCD takes the thing that you love the most or you're scared of the most and latches onto it. And that is what happened with him. It latched onto his fear and it kept him working. So a friend of mine said, do you think that he kept all of this stuff the way he kept it, organized that way, because he had to? Was he a forensic scientist? Did the OCD, which came first? And I said, I think he became a forensic scientist because of the OCD, because this was a channel for him, this was a way for him to do multiple projects, to keep control of things. But it must have just been maddening particularly to be married to him. I'm assuming it was probably not easy to be Marian Heinrich.
And not something he necessarily could have understood in his lifetime
No.
as a pathology. And then also you mentioned the sons. It didn't seem to translate to them as a bridge of understanding. It didn't seem that they got everything that he went through from his childhood and why he was so scrupulous about money. I don't know. I mean, we don't have their perspective in the same way, but
No, we don't. And one of the things that's unique about what I hope is unique about the books that I write is, like I've just been searching for book number 4, and I think hopefully found book 5 also, is that I require a really big archive. With Death in the Air, I had hundreds of internal memos between the Ministry of Housing and the Ministry of Health, blaming each other for this deadly smog.
well,
And then
that's
I had,
helpful.
and then and then I had live people. The little girl is, who lost her father during the smog, is a grandmother now. And I did extensive interviews. I went to London and met with her. So, these are all things that add to the narrative. I don't want to just do an academic book that talks about forensics or the smog. These are real people. And so for Oscar, I was so lucky because not only did he keep his letters from everybody, August Vollmer, the cop, his sort of Watson character, who was a librarian, his son Theodore. He kept all of those letters, but all of these people kept their letters from him to them. So thank goodness, Theodore, his eldest son, turned out to be a big deal in the world of theater and museums. He was one of the museum men, if you guys have seen the movie, the museum men who went in and monument men who went in and after World War II and essentially reclaimed stolen art from the Nazis. So Theodore had hundreds of letters at a Canadian university, and they were all from Oscar. Same thing with the reference librarian who was his Watson turned out to be a really big deal in the world of libraries. So he had an archive. So now all of a sudden, if I could not hold up my phone, I would, but all of a sudden you have conversations. I can cross-reference a letter that he sent on August 1st, 1929, and find out what he was doing through Theodore based on letters that Theodore received from him. So I'm actually able to put together these conversations, which is unusual for a book that's, a case that's 100 years old. All of this stuff happened 100 years ago. So I now, unfortunately, or fortunately for me, my editor kind of demands that I have to have a really good archive. I have to really bring people alive in order for a book to work for me.
Well, okay, so I want to ask if we can about books 3, 4, and 5, but specifically, do you have any sort of, are any of them going to involve the amazing archive at the Ransom Center here at UT?
I have not been able to pull that off yet. And the Ransom Center does have a really good collection. And I'm grateful forever to the PCL and to, in general, the library, UT library systems is pretty incredible. So no, the books are, well, one of them, the podcast, and I have a podcast panel that I'll be probably talking a little bit more about, but the podcast, the very first season of it came from a failed book idea. Actually, both first seasons of Tenfold More Wicked 1 and 2 were both meant to be books. And then we figured out that they would be better podcasts. Well, it turns out that season 1, which was about a man named Edward Ruloff, who was a genius and a killer at the same time in the 19th century. So after the podcast launched, I refigured my proposal for my editor. And I said, I still think this is a good book. I've changed the angle. Here's the new angle. And she said, okay, I'll buy it. We love it. So that's the book that I'm turning in the next 2 months. And that is a lot about criminal behavior. Edward Ruloff was this genius in linguistics, and he also killed quite a few people in the 19th century. And he was definitely a 19th century psychopath for sure. And it was interesting to kind of dig into his mind. There is if you've heard the podcast, I kind of skim over it, this scene, but he goes on a 30-year crime bender, I call it, and he's finally caught. And all of these people come to his defense, including Mark Twain and Horace Greeley, who said this man is too intelligent to kill. We can't, even though he's killed his wife and child and his sister-in-law and her child and a shopkeeper. And I mean, he's really not a good person, but he does say that he has a theory about languages that would be life-changing in the 19th century for people. And so you have a lot of people who just said, just let this guy finish his theory already. Don't kill him. Meantime, his in-laws, who lost 4 people to this guy, are infuriated. So there's a scene in Ruloff's life where he is shackled to the ground like Hannibal Lecter of a prison, and there is a parade of men who go through this prison while he's awaiting execution to try to figure him out. What is this guy the devil? Is he evil? Was he born like this? Was he misunderstood? Is he even guilty? Should we release him? Should we put him in an insane asylum? What should be done with this guy? So he became an avatar, really, for the criminal mind, for why we study people's brains. And why does it matter? Why does any of it matter, whether or not someone was born with a penchant for violence? And can we do anything about it? So that is the very long answer to what book number 3 is.
Oh, fantastic.
Myself through right now. I love it, but I'm so tired of Edward Ruloff because, you know, I wrote a book proposal, which is a 50-page book proposal years ago, 5 or 6 years ago. And then it wasn't so this would not be a book. And okay, well, I'll do, you know, the podcast, and I have his family. They still live on the farm, you know. So then I'm in the world of Edward Ruloff in upstate New York again for several years. And now I'm back in his world writing the book. So I love it. I love it. And I think he's a great character, but I'll be happy to move on to some other Looney Tune.
So how long is that process for the book? Is it multi-year? It sounds like.
Yeah, I mean, I tend to be a sort of a promiscuous researcher, a friend of mine says. So, you know, I cross over an awful lot. I was doing research on Ruloff when I was writing American Sherlock. And I had found American Sherlock when I was at the tail end of writing Death in the Air. So it's so hard to untangle where things start and end. It's a circle with me. I can't ever quite figure it out. And, you know, I am somebody I really respect, who I loved talking with, was H.W. Bill Brands, you know, who's a historian. And I said, I need one give me some kind of good piece of advice before I start writing the very first book. And he said, you need to start writing as soon as possible. And he said, stop, research it. You know, it's easier to just get in and to write. And he was right about that. So, you know, I tend to do enough research for my proposals so that I can really kind of jump in and start. You know, for my proposals, I have to be able to tell my editor, I've got these journals, I've got these letters, I've got family members, here's what I can offer. And so I don't make false promises. I have to have all of that stuff in my little Dropbox folder that's got the name of the book on it. And then I'm really ready to jump in. And then there's just so much, you know, with Death in the Air, particularly, I wanted a lot of character from London. So I wanted to know there are women called fluffers which now is a naughty term, but back then.
I was going to say, ooh.
No, back then in the 50s, fluffers were women who would wear these handkerchiefs, and they would go into the underground with wire brushes and clean all of the soot and pollution off the walls. And the only reason I knew that any of this and why it matters is because that was a signal of when things were getting bad with the smog. Is they called all the fluffers out from the tunnels. They were like, we're shutting down the underground, no need for the fluffers. And the rat catchers, there were men with big nets who would catch rats. So, you know, it's little things like that make a big difference in a book like mine, that make it feel like it's fiction. Because people often say to me, someone said to me actually a couple of months ago about American Sherlock, one of the books, I can't remember which one. So this is pretty much all real, right? You can't call it nonfiction if it's not 100% real. It is 100%.
Take it from a librarian.
Yeah, I mean, really. So,
well, and I've just got a couple more questions for you, Kate. So I want to throw out to the chat, get your questions in there so we don't miss out. But so you mentioned podcast stemming from a book that didn't need to be a book necessarily. What made you decide, though, to jump in to podcasting for it? Obviously, you've got a film and television background. Was it that? Right. Because not necessarily everybody thinks, oh, yeah, I'm suited to podcasting.
Right. Well, I think there are a couple of reasons. I'm lucky in a way because, you know, I worked for ABC Radio for quite a long time. So I knew I would be able to do this. I don't have a crew in the field with me. I'm on my own. I have a little backpack. I wish I could show it to you guys. I have a little backpack. You can probably see it. It's my little backpack. That's my go bag. I've got, you know, microphones in there. And so, you know, I'm going to New York next week. I just grab my bag and I go, and I know how to interview people and make the quality really high. I was a producer for a long time, so I know how to reach out to people and book stories. And so I'm kind of uniquely qualified. I'm an editor also, so I can edit my own shows. So I knew I could produce because I had done my own documentaries. I certainly could have done my own podcast stories. So there's that, I think, that I just knew I was capable of doing it. But honestly, I hate admitting this, but this was a big experiment for me, because when I started writing books, the first book I was really excited about. So Death in the Air was reviewed on Fresh Air. It was reviewed everywhere, the New York Times book review, Washington Post. It was reviewed all of these places, right? And it did well. It sold well, relatively speaking. It sold pretty well. Then the next year, the paperback came out. And I thought, okay, we're going to get some good media. And it did. It was one of 3 books that the New York Times Book Review put up and said, buy this for Christmas, which is huge, right? The New York Times Book Review for authors is the creme de la creme. And it sold 500 extra copies. That's not very much for Christmas. That's when I realized that traditional media is not the cat's pajamas. It really is not. And then I was watching 48 Hour Mysteries, just like someone's mom who watches all of the ID shows. I was watching 48 Hour Mysteries. And there was a man who was on who was talking about his grandmother and her friend who had been murdered. And he started a podcast. This is a guy with no journalism background, not a good voice. It doesn't even sound like a really good podcast. And he's saying he's had millions of downloads off of, I'm sorry to say this, what sounds to be like crappy podcast. And I thought, that is it. That is millions and millions of people, because podcasts are free. They can listen and there's no competition. And I do ad swaps with other true crime podcasts. So like Small Town Dicks, which I think is a fantastic podcast. Mm-hmm. It's pretty cool to hear Lisa Simpson read about how great my podcast is. And then I got to talk about, Lisa Simpson, the Simpsons character. Yardley is the one of the hosts of Small Town Dicks. And so we don't compete with each other because it's all free. You, Erica, can listen to 20 different true crime, and I'm sure you do, 20 different true crime podcasts. So it's a really unique medium in that way. And it's been great for my books. And it's it's a branding, which I do think all storytellers should be concerned about. Their branding. What are you known for? And I had a friend tell me, why don't you just be an author? Be the best author you can be. Why are you worried about podcasting or TV shows? Because I'm not an author, I'm a storyteller. And I can write, but I can also tell a story through audio. I can do, if I want to do documentaries, it's all, to me, what I just said at the beginning, a beginning and a middle and an end, and compelling characters. And why do we care about this story right now? And that is what I like to do. And in some ways, the medium doesn't even matter to me at this point.
Well, and are you thinking of branching out or branching back into documentary for any of these stories or anything else that you're working on?
Well, if you guys, I cannot, nobody can say anything about this, but, okay. But so be quiet, everybody be quiet.
Absolutely.
So the American Sherlock, Death in the Air was optioned by Miramax initially, and then is now being made into a scripted series through Spyglass, which is a really great production company. And I'm involved in a consulting producer kind of way. But Netflix bought the rights to American Sherlock, and it's going to be a docudrama. So I'm kind of back into the documentary thing. I'm not a producer, but I don't think it's a host, but I'll be, the main character, sort of working our way through Oscar's cases. And so I get back, I'm getting back in that way, but I don't know if I'll ever want to coordinate a crew, fly somewhere, do shoots. And it's just a lot. Podcasts are a lot easier for me. And Tenfold More Wicked is done, but my other show took over, which is called Wicked Words. And it's a simple show. I interview journalists about their best true crime stories. And so that show takes over until January when Tenfold More Wicked comes back on. So I'm just trying to learn as a storyteller, as anybody would in any business, what are my strengths and what are my weaknesses? And can I hire people to help me with my strengths and with my weaknesses and keep building on my strengths?
I've got some questions in the chat about the podcast specifically. Rachel says, I listen to your podcast every Monday on my way to work. It's been refreshing. Yeah, it's been refreshing to listen to historical true crime because it seems like in mainstream media, we just hear the same 5 cases over and over again. Anybody that watches ID know that's true.
Right.
Also, I don't know if someone has said this, but you have a great radio/podcasting voice. So congratulations.
I appreciate it. I would like to hear from you more, Rachel. Just kidding.
And Savannah asks, how has the experience been working with Karen and Georgia on Exactly Right Network?
Amazing. I mean, how can it not be? So Exactly Right is the network of My Favorite Murder, which if you guys are here, you've probably heard of My Favorite Murder. And Karen, in case you want to know, Karen and Georgia are just as wonderful as they sound, as is Billy and Billy Jensen and Paul Holes on Murder Squad. So it's been great. One of the things that I think is fantastic about Exactly Right is it, going back to true crime is absolutely, the listenership is dominated by women, especially on this network because it's run by women. We certainly have a lot of men involved, but really it's been a nice experience, sort of straddling mental health with true crime and comedy is not easy, but I totally agree with you that I think I have a little bit of an easier time with all of this because I have family members who love talking to me about the show, love it, because most of my stuff happened a couple hundred years ago. So, like the Scott family who lives on the farm still, they're invested in the story because it's part of their family lore and it says something about their family, and everybody cares about where your family comes from. But I don't feel this sort of responsibility that people feel for the stories that are happening in present day. I don't see myself ever doing a contemporary crime case. I think because of that, I think it's hard. You're dealing with people, and a lot of it still feels raw to them. And I just was the season 3 of Tenfold More Wicked, which was about a man named Howard Pearson who killed his parents. One of his parents was a associate Supreme Court judge here in Austin in 1935. That felt kind of raw to the family still because some of them still knew him, the Howard Pearson, the killer. And there is a lot of complications with that case about mental health and what was the reason why he did it. But, even cases that are only 70 or 80 years old, people are still sensitive. So, I think what the rest of the network does, Murder Squad and My Favorite Murder, with more contemporary cases, I think is good. I like sort of what they're doing. It's not for me. I like the older the better. I have one I just finished taping in Virginia from 1766. I told somebody I wanted a colonial America era story, and she brought me one. So there's so many great stories in history that no one's ever heard of that I think you can dramatize and have families that still care. Like one of the ones that I just finished in Virginia is about a terrible family feud that ended in 3 people dead. And they still care. I joined together in a reunion, these 2 families. And one of the people literally said, I'm not really bothered by it anymore. And I was thinking this happened 170 I would think not, but people, especially in Virginia, people really do care about family history. So, I think that this show is at the right home for sure with Exactly Right.
And mentioning Billy Jensen, if anyone is a fan of I'll Be Gone in the Dark, that's where I first heard of Billy Jensen. And I think they make we understand the stakes involved, and they do a good job with that for sure.
Yeah.
Now, for my final question, and I'm still monitoring the chat in case anybody has any more questions, feel free to jump in. What crime would you, Kate, personally like to solve? Follow-up question, what crime would you just like to see solved, period?
Well, there's so many of them. I mean, I could say probably, I would predict a lot of people would say John Benet Ramsey, just because it's such a painful case. But I will tell you, when I was in Virginia, I interviewed for Wicked Words. I interviewed an author named Blaine Pardoe, and he wrote a book about a case I had never heard of that maybe some of you guys had heard of, the Colonial Parkway murders. Do you guys remember that?
I'm also from Virginia too. Yeah, I know that one.
So I had not really heard that case. So late 80s, early 90s, over a 3-year period, 4 couples, which is unusual, 4 couples murdered. And I think that that is a case that could be solved. There's DNA in that case now. And it is just a very Jack the Ripper-y feeling case. He posed them and he put them, he found people in kind of druggy areas. One of them was off the Colonial Parkway in a different area. He set it up so that someone would come steal the cars. Hopefully, it never worked. But, you know, this was a meticulous serial killer, and he was never caught. And to be brazen enough to go after couples, and each couple had this sort of tragic story, and their families just were left with no answers. I mean, this guy really was in the wind. It was like a ghost did it. I've never thought about that, like what that would be like. And I think the only other case would be my buddy Skip Hollandsworth wrote a book about the Midnight Assassin, which is a serial killer in Austin that happened in the 1800s, late 1800s. And that would be fascinating to know what really happened with that case.
I saw a couple of years ago on History's Detectives. I don't know if anybody was a fan of that on PBS. They came up with, I think, some reasonable suspects, and one in particular. So I was really glad to see that too, because I had never heard of it until I moved here and then realized, oh yeah, this is a big deal.
So I'll tell you something that's interesting, Erica, is that in Austin, they have a ghost tour that is centered kind of on Midnight Assassin. So the one suspect I think that most people think is the most likely suspect, this ties back to forensics, is a guy who was very abusive. He was in a saloon and he was threatening to kill a woman. Like, he was very violent. So this one man was dragged outside kind of by a vigilante group after he was beating up a woman in a saloon, and they shot and killed him. And when the autopsy was done, they discovered that he was missing, I think it was a pinky toe, and they had matched it to the Midnight Assassin. The axe murderer didn't wear shoes, which was pretty smart. So but it looked like the footprint was missing a toe of this, the man who had axed all of these women. And as we know about forensics, that's just crap.
Right.
That's not bad. So in the 1800s, where they thought that this is the closest they were going to get, but I'm not convinced that guy did anything. I will tell you something weird though.
Oh,
right. So one of my stories, and it'll probably ruin one of the stories that I'm going to do, but one of my stories is about this guy named Eugene Burt. His father was William Burt, who was the medical examiner for Austin during this time period. So Eugene Burt was actually on the crime scene as a teenager, and he found an axe in the 2 white women. It was mostly people of color who had been killed up until Christmas Eve in 86, I think 1886. And then 2 white women were killed. So William Burt, the medical examiner, brings his son along. And Eugene goes to the house and finds this axe and hands it to his dad at this crime scene. And then the dad dies a few years later. Fast forward 7 or 8 years later, and Eugene Burt axed his wife and 2 little girls in Austin and put them in a cistern and took off. Can you imagine? I think he was too young to have done this, but I will tell you, he also, as a young kid, impaled animals live animals, rabbits, and that's what Midnight
Wow.
Assassin. So now I've just
Whoa.
whole future podcast, but that's okay.
Well, it still gave me chills.
Yeah.
Again, we're talking about something 150 years ago, roughly, that it still feels so connected.
It's the same themes though. I mean, we all crime, it doesn't matter if it happened 1,000 years ago, it all has the same themes. Things happen and that's what's just to conclude, what's interesting to me about true crime is it shines a light on parts of society that sometimes don't, mental health and domestic violence. I mean, there's a lot of things that we don't want to talk about that if you insert them in the right way in true crime stories, it allows us to have these kind of important conversations. I've had a lot of people reach out to me, domestic violence survivors reach out to me after the Ruloff story because he was abusive. After season 1, a couple of them reached out to me and said, this really resonates with me and here's why. And so, you can't ever undervalue true crime in that way. I know that it has kind of a trashy reputation sometimes, but I think it also can be, it's really important as a way to tell stories, and pass on history too.
Mm-hmm. Well, and a couple of comments from the chat. Brandy from Texas Wine and True Crime, who's going to be joining us later on the podcast panel, she was saying, yes, love Skip Hollandsworth. Hopefully they're going to be doing a collaboration soon. So
Cool.
Excellent for Brandy. And Daphne, I'm so sorry to see this, Daphne. Daphne said, it would be phenomenal to have my cousin's murder case solved after 35 years.
Wow.
The Gillette murders from 1985 in Corpus Christi. So fingers
Gillette.
crossed, Daphne.
Daphne, you should email me. Shoot me an email, info@tenfoldmorewicked.com, because if it's not something that we would do, that's a little young for us, 85, but I still think it's interesting. I could get you over to Murder Squad. So that would be good. Cool. That's great.
Absolutely. And yes, if anybody doesn't have any more questions, I'm going to thank Kate once again. And Kate, just as you mentioned with your email, just remind us how we can find you and the books and the podcasts and all of that great stuff.
Sure. So, the books are all on wherever you would buy books. I love buying local. So, and I have a website for the author side of me, which is just my name, KateWinklerDawson.com. And then you can plug in Tenfold More Wicked or my name into Apple Podcasts, and both of the shows will pop up. The interview show and, Tenfold More Wicked, which is on hiatus. We did 3 seasons. And then it goes on hiatus until January, and then we'll have 3 more seasons. It's a little more high maintenance than Wicked Word, so it's harder. So just search my name and you'll find all of that stuff. I really appreciate you guys having me, and I think we're back on in 45 minutes. Is that right?
Let's see. Sorry, let me check. Okay, we're going to take a very short break. We've got our trivia game starting at 2:30, and then we'll be back at podcasting panel at 3:15.
3:15. Okay. Well, hopefully my internet survives. If not, I have.
And everyone on the call says thank you, thank you, thank you, thank you,
Thank you
Kate.
guys. Thank you. I appreciate it.
And I will put us on hold here for just a moment. We're going to take just a very short break. Everybody go run to the restroom, grab your chapstick, whatever you need. Get your pencils and paper ready for the true crime trivia contest. I'm not going to lie, I made it pretty hard, I hope. So, but we've got 3 great prizes to give away. Even if the score is 3, 2, and 1, we've still got some great stuff for people. So we will see everybody back who wants to be in the true crime trivia contest at 2:30, which is in roughly 2 minutes or so. Okay.
Can I do that or qualified?
You.
No, I won't.
I did make it pretty hard, Kate.
Oh, please.
So you can try. You can try if you want to.
I'm going to get something to eat. I'll be back in 2 minutes.
Okay.
Okay, bye. What the fuck?
Hey everyone, this is Erica. I am back on And everyone feel free, if you want to go ahead and turn your cameras back on if you like. Then I can see if you're, frantically waving to me during the um, true crime trivia contest. I'll get started here in just a second. I've got the contest prizes up. We've got first prize is 1 year Stitcher Radio Premium subscription. Second prize, swag from Cults, Crimes, and Cabernets, who will also be joining us for the podcast panel. And the third prize, free mystery books. So let's see. Let me make sure. To get everything ready to go. Okay, I see some people are joining us on the video. Awesome, thank you. And making sure, can everybody still hear me okay? Great, thank you. Okay. All right, so I've got the list of questions. Let me run through the rules here real fast. You will have 15 seconds to write down your answer after the question is read. Each correct answer is worth 1 point. Correct spelling is not required because you're keeping track of this yourself, but we're looking for the closest approximation of the correct answer. Please do not yell out your answers. We've got 3 rounds, 10 questions each, and we'll take a short break after round 3. After each round, anybody that didn't hear the question, just put it in the chat or wave your hand or speak up and I will reread it. I will then, once we're finished with that round, I'll call out the correct answers. So you're responsible for tallying your own points. It's all in the honor system. Please no outside sources. Please no cell phone use during the round. If we have a tie, I've got a ton of tiebreaker questions. And so the first person to answer it correctly will win. And yeah, so hopefully we'll have some fun here. Now let's see, I'm gonna mute. Yeah, so we'll have some fun. Go ahead. Got a couple of people not muted. Sorry, give me just 1 second. Okay. All right. And if you're not muted, please do so. If you want to turn your camera on, feel free. I'm going to let some more people are joining us as we speak. I want to give everybody a chance to jump in and play. Okay, so are we all clear on rules? Mute, I'll answer, or excuse me, I'll read the question. You'll have 10 to 15 seconds to write it down. At the end of the round, I'll reread any questions anybody didn't hear. I'll give the answers, we'll tally the points and go from there. Okay? All right, so first round. These are all Texas questions, okay? So our Texans may or may not have a leg up in this competition. Question 1. Which family members did Charles Whitman kill before he went to the University of Texas at Austin's University Tower, killing an additional 15 people, an unborn child, and wounding 32 others on August 1st, 1966? Go. And I'm just watching my time. Which family members did Charles Whitman kill before he went to the tower? And that's time. Question number 2. And remember, you can re-ask these through the round. Question number 2. Between February and May 1946, the Texarkana Moonlight Murders sent the border town of Texarkana into a panic. What is the real name of the murderer who was dubbed the Phantom Killer? And go. 1946, Texarkana Moonlight Murders and the Phantom Killer. And time. Question number 3. What was the name of Henry Lee Lucas's sidekick, who was also responsible for the murder of Adam Walsh? Your time starts now. And that's your time. Question 4. What is the name of the 25-acre stretch of land just off of Interstate 45 that's known for being the prime place to dump the bodies of more than 30 young women from the ages of 12 to 19 since the 1970s? Go. And that's your time. Question 5. We're halfway through round 1. Now considered to be the US's most prolific serial killer, what man was the confirmed killer of Denise Christie brothers in Odessa, Texas? Go.
Have your employers.
And time. Question 6. On December 6th, 1991, 4 teenage employees of a yogurt franchise were murdered in Austin, Texas. What was the name of the yogurt shop? Go. And that's time. Question number 7. Which member of the Manson family was born on December 2nd, 1945 in Farmersville? Go. And time. Question number 8. Who was arrested, tried, convicted, sentenced to death, then eventually exonerated 12 years later for the murder of Dallas, Texas police officer Robert W. Wood, as seen in the documentary film The Thin Blue Line? Go. And time. Question 9. 2 questions to go. Deborah Louise Jackson was a victim known for nearly 40 years only as Orange Socks, until her DNA was matched to a surviving family member in 2019. Her murder is believed to have taken place on October 30th or 31st, 1979 in Georgetown, Texas, right up the road. Who confessed to and was convicted of her murder? Go. And time. Last question for round 1. Who was sometimes called the most hated woman in America due to her atheism and other beliefs? She was killed along with her son and granddaughter in Austin in 1995 by a former employee. What was her name? and time. So those are the 10 questions in round 1. So let me check the chat. Ooh, thank you everybody who likes the questions. And yes, they are always on the tip of your tongue, aren't they? So please raise your hand or unmute yourself or put it in the chat if you need any of questions 1 through 10 reread to you. Take a minute to look it through. Good job, Daphne. Anybody need a question that I'm just not seeing? Sorry, I'm scrolling through the gallery, but just yell if you need anything reread. Give everybody one more second. I'm going to ask Julie to read the answers. There you go. And she'll get in her seat and it'll be just 1 second. So Daphne says she got 7 of them. Anybody think that they got all 10? No? Okay, Julie, take it away.
Okay, we're ready. So question 1. Which family members did Charles Whitman kill before he went into University Tower? The answer is his mother and his wife. For question 2, between February and May of 1946, the Texarkana moonlight murder sent the border town of Texarkana into a panic. What is the real name of the murderer? That is still unsolved. If you know the answer to that, that would be really phenomenal. And number 3.
It was a trick question.
Number 3, what was the name of Henry Lee Lucas's sidekick, who was also responsible for the murder of Adam Walsh? The answer is Otis Toole. Otis Toole. Sorry. Number 4, what is the name of the 25-acre stretch of land just off of Interstate 45 that's known for being the prime place to dump the bodies of more than 30 young women? That is known as the Texas Killing Fields. Number 5, now considered to be the U.S.'s most prolific serial killer, what man was the confirmed killer of Denise Christie brothers in Odessa, Texas? And the answer is Samuel Little. Number 6, on December 6, 1991, 4 teenage employees of a yogurt franchise were murdered in Austin, Texas. What was the name of the yogurt shop? I can't believe it's yogurt. Number 7, which member of the Manson family was born on December 2nd, 1945 in Farmersville? That was Charles Tex Watson. Number 8, who was arrested, tried, convicted, sentenced to death, and eventually exonerated 12 years later for the murder of Dallas, Texas police officer Robert Wood, as seen in the documentary film The Thin Blue Line? That was Randall Dale Adams. Number 9, Deborah Louise Jackson was a victim known for nearly 40 years only as Orange Socks until her DNA was matched to a surviving family member in 2019 who confessed to and was convicted of her murder. That was Henry Lee Lucas. And finally, number 10, who was sometimes called the most hated woman in America due to her atheism and other beliefs? And she was killed along with her son and granddaughter in Austin in 1995 by a former employee. That was Madeline Murray O'Hare.
Okay. Looks like Kathy got 6. Daphne, did you get 7? Angie got 6. We got a bunch of ties at 6. Okay. The race is heating up. It's a good thing I have all of these final tiebreaker sudden death questions. Get it? So now we have a round 2 coming up. Everybody take a moment. Again, let me know if you had any problems with the questions. Kim got 4, Zelda got 5, Jess got 7. Woo! Before we move to round 2. Okay, so everybody reset. Get ready for round 2. Round 2 is the national round. Okay, so we went all over the country. And one of these questions for sure everybody should get. Okay, everybody ready to go for round 2? Anybody concerned? Perfect. All right. So again, I'll go through the questions. Once we get to the end, let me know if you need anything repeated. You've got about 15 seconds to answer, and then we'll go through the answers once we are all set. Okay, got one person joining the call right now. Okay, round 2, the national round. Question 1. Which serial killer stood 6 foot 9 inches tall and investigators labeled him a natural born killer? Go. And that's time. Question number 2. Herman Webster Mudgett, better known as Dr. Henry Howard Holmes, or H.H. Holmes, was convicted and sentenced to death for how many murders? As he confessed to more than 24, was a trigamist, and built his own murder castle in Chicago, Illinois. But how many was he convicted of? And go. And time. Question 3. How many times were Andrew Borden and Abby Borden struck with the hatchet-like weapon? Go. I can see wheels literally turning in people's brains right now. I love it. And time. And by the way, BB let us know Sisters in Crime Heart of Texas chapter hosted one of the FBI agents who solved the Madeline Murray O'Hare case. Very interesting. Okay, question 4. On the night he shot John Lennon, which book was killer Mark David Chapman carrying? Go. And time. Question 5. We're halfway. What does SSGDM stand for? SSGDM. Go. And time. Question number 6. And if this doesn't freak you out, I don't know what would. What was the name of John Wayne Gacy's clownish alter ego? Go. I see tips of tongues. I told you it was hard. And time. Question number 7. In which state did serial killer Dennis Lynn Rader, or BTK, operate? Go. And time. Question number 8. The alleged identity of the Golden State Killer came through genetic genealogy. What is the name of the book written by Michelle McNamara, who passed away before suspect Joseph James D'Angelo Jr. could be arrested? I actually mentioned this during Kate's discussion. Go. And time. Question number 9. 2 questions to go. What iconic TV game show did Rodney Alcala appear on during his crime spree? Go. And time. Last question for round 2. During the 1980s, what torturous twosome was nabbed by police after attempting to steal a vice from a California hardware store? Go. And time. Okay, those were the 10 questions in round 2. Please wave at me or put in the chat or yell, speak up if you need anything repeated, questions 1 through 10 from the national round. Give everybody a second to look over everything. How do we think we did with round 2 compared to round 1? Sir Night Night is looking pretty smug over there. I think he thinks he did great. Zelda said much better. Sarah has asked me to repeat question number 10. Question number 10. During the 1980s, what torturous twosome was nabbed by police after attempting to steal a vise from a California hardware store? So we'll give Zelda a sec. Any other questions that need to be repeated? Rachel has asked for question number 3. Question number 3. How many times were Andrew Borden and Abby Borden struck with a hatchet-like weapon? Okay, anybody else? Daphne says she thinks she only got 3. We'll see. Okay, anybody else before we go through the answers? So get ready to tally. Okay, question number 1, which was about the serial killer who stood 6 foot 9 inches and was called a natural born killer. That's Ed Kemper. Question number 2, Herman Webster Mudgett, or Dr. H.H. Holmes, was convicted and sentenced to death for 1 murder, and that was of his accomplice and business partner, Benjamin Pizzetzel. Question 3. We all know the song, Lizzie Borden Took the Axe. Not correct. Andrew Borden had been hit 10 or 11 times. Abby Borden had been hit 18 times. Question number 4. On the night he shot John Lennon, Mark David Chapman was carrying The Catcher in the Rye. A cliche for years to come afterwards. Question 5, and this got mentioned during Kate's section. What does SSGDM stand for? That stands for Stay Sexy, Don't Get Murdered, coined by the My Favorite Murder podcast. Question number 6, the one that freaks me out. John Wayne Gacy's clownish alter ego, Pogo. Question 7, the BTK killer was in Kansas. I can hear Julie behind me. She thought it was Arkansas. Nope, Kansas, baby. Question number 8, the Golden State Killer. The book written about the Golden State Killer by Michelle McNamara was I'll Be Gone in the Dark. Question 9, which TV game show did Rodney Alcala appear on during his crime spree? That was The Dating Game, which is also quite gross and scary. Okay, final question of round 2. During the 1980s, which twosome was nabbed by police when they were trying to steal a vise? That was Leonard Lake and Charles Ng. Okay, so everybody's got their tallies. I see some 5s, some 6s. Sir Night Night was correct to be smug. He got 8. 5, 7, way to go. This is a hot contest. Okay, and keeping track of everything, we've got one more round to go. 6 from Zelda, awesome. Okay, so reset yourself. Take a minute. Kim got 2, that's okay, Kim. Because round 3, we're about to go international. International. Okay. All right, so everybody give me the thumbs up if they're ready to go for the next round. Looks good, looks good. Fantastic. Okay. Okay. Question number 1 in the international round. What is the name of the former British doctor who is known as the most prolific modern serial killer in history and is believed to be responsible for killing more than 215 patients? Time starts now. And time. Question number 2. How many victims did Peter, the Yorkshire Ripper, Sutcliffe claim the lives of? This is a little bit of a trick. And time. Question number 3. In what country did killer Catherine Mary Knight stab her partner to death, skin him, then put his skin on a meat hook and cooked his head and parts of his body with the intention of feeding them to his children? What country? Yeah, Kathy, it's no joke. And that's your time. Question number 4. Ian Brady was the male partner of a pair of serial killers who terrorized the Lancashire area of England. What is the name of Brady's female accomplice? Go. Okay, Sir Night Night, are you feeling a smug right now? See you looking at the camera, not sure, so, and that's time. Question 5. The case of Bible John was an unsolved murder case of 3 women in Scotland. In which Scottish city did these crimes occur? Go. And time. Question 6. On November 13, 1993, police received a call from Paul Onions in the UK. 3 years earlier, he had been backpacking in Australia, and while hitchhiking from Liverpool Station towards Mildura, he accepted a ride south from a man known only as Bill. This note was mislaid by Australian police and not discovered until 1994. The note finally led police to the identity of the backpacker murderer. What was this serial killer's name? Go. It was an inspiration for Wolf Creek, if you've seen that film. And time. Question number 7. Which British couple may have murdered as many as 30 people, including several of their own children? Go. Sandra's shaking her head, looking at me like, no idea. That's okay, Sandra. We'll get the next one. And time. Question number 8. Which militant group violently took over the small town of Chibok, Nigeria, and abducted 276 girls from their school? Go. And done. Question number 9, 2 questions to go. The Isdal woman is a placeholder name given to a still unidentified woman who was found dead at Isdalen, or the Ice Valley, in which country in 1970? Go. And time. Last question, guys. Last question of all 3 rounds. Number 10. In which country did the Soviet serial killer known as Metal Fang operate between 1979 and 1980? Go. Last question. Couple more seconds. And time. Okay, round 3. Yell if you need anything repeated. I know that was a lot of detail. Not all of us are super up on our international crime, but let me know if you need any question repeated before we get to the answers. And everyone is recommending Case File as a great international true crime podcast, by the way. Okay, looks like everybody's good. I'm going to read the answers. How do we think we did, though, on this one? Better, worse, not quite as good? Okay. Question number 1, the name of the former British doctor who killed more than 215 patients. That's Dr. Harold Shipman. Remember, tallying is totally honor system, so just keep track. Question 2, the Yorkshire Ripper. How many lives did he claim? 13, though he also attacked 10 more, bringing the total to 23. Question 3, in which country did Catherine Mary Knight stab her partner, skin him, put his skin on a meat hook, cook its head, tried to feed it to the children? That was Australia. Yes. Not Arkansas. Okay, just joking, Arkansas. Question 4. Ian Brady worked with which female accomplice? That was Myra Hindley. They targeted children between the ages of 10 and 17. These were called the Moors murders. Question 5. Where in Scotland did Bible John commit 3 unsolved murders? That was in Glasgow. Sorry, Kathy, I'm sorry about the Arkansas thing. My bad. But that was in Glasgow, number 5. Number 6, the identity of the backpacker murder. That was Ivan Milat. Ivan Milat. Between 1989 and 1993, he assaulted, imprisoned, robbed, and murdered 2 men and 5 women. Very scary. If you've ever seen Wolf Creek, it's terrifying. Question 7. The British couple who may have murdered as many as 30 people, including several of their own children. That's the Wests, Fred and Rosemary West. Question 8. Which militant group abducted the Nigerian schoolgirls? That's Boko Haram. Question 9, there's also a fantastic podcast about this called Death in Ice Valley. This was the Isdal woman. In 1970, she was found dead in Norway. Okay, in Norway. Read about the case, it's fascinating. The time of the crime, they ruled it a likely suicide, but there's been this speculation ever since. It's possible that she was a spy. It was an incredibly interesting case. Last question, guys. Number 10. See if you got this right. In which country did the metal fang operate? That was present-day Kazakhstan. Okay, so I'll give everybody a sec to jump in. Oh, Angie got 1, 2. Zelda got 5. Nice. Daphne got 3. Way to go. Take your time. Calculate all the rounds that you participated in. Rachel got 0. That's okay, Rachel. Thank you, Kim. I worked hard on those questions. So do your full count. And we'll see if we've got any ties. Looks like so far, Zelda is in the lead with 16. Everybody's scoring. Sir Night Night coming in at 18. Woo woo. 18's the number to beat. Thank you, Angie. I'm glad you had fun. Okay. All right. Everybody's still great, Kathy. Thank you. Sorry for the Arkansas thing again, Kathy. We got to joke about somebody in Texas. Okay. All right. Any other people still tallying up? So, Julia, I'll ask you to take a look. I can see kind of, Whitney, that's true. My husband is an Okie, so I tend not to make fun of Okies.
It looks like Sir Night Night is in the lead with 18. Second place is Zelda with 16. Jess is third with 15. Is there anyone else that got 15 or 16? So for those 3, congratulations. And can you send in the chat, or you can send me your email at JCH. I'll put my email there. And you winners, let me know, and we will get you connected with your prizes.
And to recap what those prizes are, we've got the 1-year Stitcher Radio premium subscription. We've got our awesome swag coming from our friends at Cults, Crimes, and Cabernets. And we have got this super cool stack of super fresh books from the library. So we'll get everything coordinated for everybody. Thank you, everyone, so much for participating in that quiz. I'm so glad that everybody had fun, it looks like, and that I was trying to stump as many people as possible. So I feel good about that. Just means you've got to read more, listen to more podcasts, and all of the free time that you have, of course. Just kidding. Just kidding. I didn't even have to break out my sudden death questions, which were pretty nuts too. But anyway, if you email me, I'll send them to you on the down low. Okay, so we have got our last presentation of the afternoon coming up here in just a moment. I'm going to sign off for just 1 second while I get everything resettled back in, and we'll be joined by all of our friends from these awesome podcasts that we have. So everybody hang on, and we will be back in just a second. Let me get myself muted and off for just a minute. See everybody in just a moment. Hey everybody, I'm back. Let's see, and I know that I've got some of my podcasters on already. I see Vincent, I see Whitney, I see Michael, I see Brandy, I see Kate, I see Texas 1031. It looks like we're all there. Thank you guys. Okay. Let me just get resituated. So what I'll ask is that our podcasters, unmute themselves as they desire. If everybody else could stay muted, that would be fantastic. Please again, use the chat if you have any questions. Julie's monitoring that for us as well. And we'll try to field as many of those as we can. So if everybody is in place and they look like they are, Whitney, it looks like you're outside. Oh my goodness, okay. All right.
Apologies, I'm having to come to you live from Starbucks because my real day job, I had to go show, I'm a real estate agent in real life. So I had to go show a few houses, take a break, showing a couple after this. So you're getting me live from Starbucks.
And not to be grotesque, but we know that real estate is sometimes a terrifying scene for true crime. So stay safe, Whitney. Okay. Okay, so podcasters and everyone who has joined us, thank you. I see Pam right there. Pam's so excited. Her daughter is one of our presenters. Thank you, Pam. So I want to introduce everyone to our wonderful slate of podcasters today. Thank you so much for joining us. We so appreciate you taking the time out from all the work you do to come to our first annual, hopefully, Texas True Crime Minicon here at Round Rock Public Library. So we've got Gone Cold, Texas Wine and True Crime, Unresolved, Cults, Crimes, and Cabernets, Tenfold More Wicked, and Texas 1031. So I'm going to ask everybody in turn just to briefly introduce themselves and their shows. Let us know how we can find you. We'll, of course, come back to that at the end as well. But I'd love to start with Gone Cold. Vincent, if you don't mind.
Yes, my name's Vincent, Gone Cold. You can find us anywhere you find podcasts. We're on Facebook, all the social medias, I suppose. Just by searching Gone Cold, I think is the best way to do that. And we have a website, but there's nothing really there. It's
Okay.
no good, no good really. But,
Okay.
but feel
Thank
free.
you, Vincent. How about our friends over at Texas Wine and True Crime?
Hi there, I'm Brandy. I host Texas Wine and True Crime. You can find us anywhere you listen to your podcasts. And I drink, talk about Texas wine, and tell a true crime story out of Texas.
Sounds good. How about Unresolved? Michael he just had a baby.
Yep.
Michael didn't, but we
Yeah.
we get the
Yeah.
idea.
Thankfully, I did not birth a baby girl, but my wife did just about 6 weeks ago. So, yeah, still getting used to the sleep deprivation. But yeah. My name is Michael. I host Unresolved. It's a podcast primarily about unsolved crime, but also every now and then I'll dabble into other strange mysteries and stuff like that. But yeah, I'm available on any platform, and my website is unresolved.me if you want to check anything out.
Thank you, Michael. How about Cults, Crimes, and Cabernet?
My name is Whitney. I co-host Cults, Crimes, and Cabernet with my best friend Melissa. Unfortunately, she couldn't be here today. It's her youngest son's birthday, so she's spending the day with him. So you just get me. Just like everyone else, we're anywhere you can find a podcast. We do have a website, cultscrimescabernet.com. We try to keep it updated, but as you know, you get kind of behind in that manner. So
Life happens.
yes. And yeah, I'm excited to be here.
Thank you. And back to Kate, who was so great to do our first presentation with us. Kate, thank you.
Thanks. I'm Kate Winkler Dawson. I'm the host of Tenfold, More Wicked and Wicked Words, which are both on the Exactly Right network. And you can find us everywhere. And probably they are more updated. The Exactly Right network website's more updated than my website. So you can
And
find us
Kate,
there.
the burning question, did you sit in on the trivia contest?
I did not. So I got in for one question, which was a really good question, the Whitman question, and then my kids got into a fight. So I had
So
to
true crime was
choose.
happening at home.
I did.
You had to step away.
I did.
And last but certainly not least, our friends over at Texas 1031.
Hi,
I'm Cassie.
I'm Hannah.
You can find us. We're on all the things, right?
Yeah.
Apple, Stitcher, not Spotify.
We don't have a website anymore.
No.
We don't really use our social media that much because
No.
we don't record as often as we'd like. But here you go.
There's things.
I printed a paper.
Thank you. And you could share it in the chat too if you get a second. We'll try to do that as well. Okay, so welcome everybody. Thank you again. I want to kick it off back with our friend Vincent over at Gone Cold. So Vincent, and then I'll turn it over to everybody else. Vincent, how did you first find your love of true crime?
I think as a kid, I was always a big fan of like unsolved mysteries, particularly maybe a little bit of forensic files through the years, but definitely unsolved mysteries, Robert Stack. And I don't know that I've ever been like a true crime junkie per se, but how we got into podcasting was the Carla Walker case, and that kind of fascinated us for a number of reasons. And then we, once getting a hold of the family, it becomes a little personal. Yeah, I avoid a lot nowadays because when you're writing it and recording it all the time, it's I don't know. I choose to kind of absorb myself in like comedy and stuff.
You got to know when
outside.
to step away.
Yeah, it gets pretty rough. So I still read a little bit here and there, and but I wouldn't call myself absorbed in it in any way besides the podcast, which is like many hours a week, as everyone here knows.
Yeah.
So
That's pretty absorbing.
but yeah, the Carla Walker case is for sure what got us doing this. I don't know if everybody's familiar with that.
No, I would for the people who aren't, especially because we've got a lot of folks who are not Texans. So yeah,
True.
if you
Yeah.
wouldn't mind.
Sorry, I'm used to everybody I talk to knows about it. It seems like it was 1974 February, and Carla Walker and her boyfriend were they'd attended a high school of Valentine's dance. Uh, Long story short, they were parked outside a bowling alley. A man who is now been identified as Glenn Samuel McCurley, I guess I'm supposed to say allegedly, ripped her out of the vehicle, beat the boyfriend over the head with the butt of a pistol. She was found, 3.5 days later, strangled, raped in a culvert. And for 46 years, it went unsolved till last year. So
Amazing.
yeah.
And our friends at Texas Wine and True Crime, how about you guys? How did the true crime bug find you?
So I just like Vincent, watching things as a child, I think getting involved unsolved mysteries, that sort of thing. But honestly, for me, I was living in Ventura, California when the Night Stalker was happening. So I remember what it was like to not be able to play outside after a certain time. When you have something going on like that where you're living. And I just remember being fascinated with it. And then the older I got, and then I researched it to where I was old enough to actually look at it and look at the case and figure this out. But it kind of started there, and just sort of this fascination with, like Kate was saying earlier, women just kind of sort of have this fascination with true crime. And it is that beginning and the middle and the end. And as podcasters and storytellers, I think you have a passion for it. You have a passion for, like what Vincent was talking about, of just solving cold cases and bringing cold cases to light, and really just getting answers for families. So you have this fascination part of it, I think, and then you have this part of it where you want to make a difference, and it only takes that one person. So, which is why I started podcasting.
And Michael at Unresolved, as you mentioned, you're only talking about cases that have not been solved. Is that what kind of got you in, that question of what actually happened?
Yeah, just these stories that, we're all drawn to, I don't know, simple story structure. We want stories that have a conclusion. And for me, I'm kind of drawn to the stories that don't have that third act. Those are the stories that always appeal to me. Probably like everyone here, grew up watching Unsolved Mysteries. Robert Stack was the man. Getting to hear those stories and on a weekly basis was just amazing, especially a lot of stories that you wouldn't have heard on the news. And for me, that was always kind of a big draw, wanting to cover stories that weren't getting a lot of coverage elsewhere. And growing up, I grew up on the West Coast. So I spent my first few years in California, and kind of became obsessed with the Zodiac because I grew up in the Bay Area. And then and then moving to Western Washington, where, it's like the mecca of serial killers. There's Green River Killer, everyone pretty much spent time up there, Bundy. But it's just, I don't know. It was always kind of a weird fascination for me. And it wasn't until about 6 years ago, I started doing a really in-depth write-up on what everyone calls the Golden State Killer. And at that point, I was just figuring out, I was trying to figure out why no one was talking about him, because there weren't documentaries, there weren't books at the time. And I was like, this guy's a menace. How is this not the most popular story in the world?
Mm-hmm.
But that eventually led to me starting the podcast, and 6 years later, here I am.
And Whitney, you and your podcasting partner, do you feel like you guys got in for kind of the same sorts of reasons?
Sort of. I mean, we were the elder millennial section of people who did grow up with unsolved mysteries. My mom is Pam in the audience here. She was big into true crime growing up. So I mean, it was Dateline. Every time Dateline was on, we were watching it. We watched the traditional kind of dramas based off of true crime, like Seven. I always talk about how I watched the movie Seven, probably way too young, but that kind of intrigued me into kind of serial killers and that kind of psychological aspect of it. And Melissa, my co-host, is the same way. And then when the pandemic hit, where we would sit on these Zoom calls or FaceTime talking about which podcast did you listen to today, or which case were you listening to today? We were like, why are we sitting here talking about it? Maybe other people want to join in this conversation with us. And Cults, Crimes, and Cabernet was born over a glass of wine.
There you go. And Kate, speaking of family influence, we had talked about in the first session about your dad at UT and the Innocence Project. I mean, you come from this stuff pretty naturally as well. Kate, did I lose you? Oh, she's trying to get unmuted. Sorry, Kate. Sorry,
I
I
did,
cut you on-
no, you're good. My dad was a law professor at UT for 37 years, and I was a journalist. I've been a journalist for most of my life, so I've covered crime. So many of the stories that I've done, I've had to cover crime, and I've been a true crime fan forever. My mom was a clinical psychologist and a huge true crime fan, so all of the things just sort of intersected, particularly just my work as a journalist. It's just part of your job is you cover really high profile cases. And that's what I ended up doing. So, but I actually am, I think it was Vincent who said, you're not entrenched in true crime outside of the job. I'm pretty much always entrenched in it. If I'm just finished watching 48-Hour Mysteries right before this came on. So it's a really big part for me of my entertainment and what I like to read. And I also like creepy things. I always say if it weren't a horrible fire hazard, I would have a gas lamp in every room in my house. So, but I think it's good to be passionate about what you like. So.
And Texas 1031, how about you guys?
I never watched the stack, whatever that show.
No.
Yeah, but I watched Forensic Files with my mom. I think we both did. Yeah,
Sure.
that was my start into it.
I like Unsolved Mysteries, but
I've never seen
it.
Looking back on it, yeah, I mean, I watched it religiously, and I was mentioning during the intro, they actually filmed one down the street from my house based on a case, so that got me into it. But Forensic Files took it to such a different level.
Yeah, it's the best theme song, you know what I mean? Bing, 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 bing. No. I think that I started getting into true crime probably pretty early when I was a kid. My dad and my brother and I would watch like the Jeremy Brett Sherlock Holmes TV show, and probably pretty dark for a child to be watching, but that really left an impact with me. I remember watching a Lifetime movie about Martha Moxley. That was probably my first case that really got me into it.
Oh my God, Lifetime.
Yeah. And then I ended up changing my career path to criminal justice because I just watched way too much investigation discovery and read too many books and listened to too much stuff. So
yeah, she's much more immersed than I am. I'm kind of like I watch so much more comedy and do other things with my other time.
That's healthy as well. We appreciate that too. Well, that's so fascinating that propelled you into criminal justice as well.
Yeah, I mean, I really enjoyed it. It was frustrating because you watch this stuff or you read this thing and you're like, why isn't anyone doing anything about it? Like, how do you find people to help? And it's like, well, step up and do it yourself.
It's you.
It's me.
Yeah.
But yeah, not to be cool or try to sound cool.
We totally understand, and it is cool.
Thank you.
We're glad that you're doing it.
Thank you, Erica.
Now, back over for Whitney for just a second. You got started in the pandemic. You don't have a huge backlog of episodes, but if you were to recommend a place for us as a casual listener to jump in, where would it be? And is that because of the episode or the case or the characters?
Episode 7, 100%. That's what we tell everyone. Start at number 7. Please don't listen to our 1 through 6. We had no clue what we were doing. The quality is terrible. I mean, we sat in Melissa's kitchen, which is tile, because that's the best place to record, right? So no, it's not. It echoes. There's kids screaming in the background. Like, we tell everyone at 7, we discovered her bedroom where there's carpet, and that's the best place to start listening.
Awesome. So episode 7, what is that episode?
So our season 1, we called it The Atrocities Around America, and we went alphabetically through the states in the United States. And episode 7, we get to BTK, and to be honest, there was lots of wine involved in this episode.
As a coping mechanism?
Yes. And I really hung on the fact that he liked to wear women's underwear. So there's a comedy aspect to this episode in particular. It lightens the horrible things that he did more so than any of our other episodes, I believe. So it's one that I like to encourage people to get into our podcast a little bit, because it's a little bit lighter than others.
Okay. Good to know. Okay. Same question over to Michael. I know which one I would suggest, but I want to hear what your choice is.
Yeah, this is a really tough one. I have quite the backlog, and I'm not necessarily like a series person, so I have a lot of standalone stories. Personally, the ones that I've probably fallen down the rabbit hole the most on there's a Bardstown series. There's this town in Kentucky called Bardstown, and there was a series of really bizarre mysteries. There were a number of murders and disappearances that happened in a really short period of time. Some people think they're linked. I would recommend that series, and then probably my Brabant Killers series. And for anyone that doesn't know anything about the Brabant Killers, there was this band of wackos in Belgium in the 1980s that basically went on like this really in-depth killing spree. It's really hard to describe. They didn't really have any stated objective or goals, but they killed approximately 30 people, wounded 40 others. It was, just a serious atrocity. But I would recommend people start with those. Those are probably the ones that I became the most obsessive over.
Okay, good to know. How about Vincent?
Yeah, that's tough too. Probably the Fort Worth Missing Trio. It's about three girls who went missing in Fort Worth here in 1974, December 1974, just before Christmas. What happened to them is a pretty big mystery. There's a letter involved. That's the object of a lot of speculation and argument. And there's just a lot of mythology behind it. I think most of it, I'm not sure if it was so helpful to the case, but probably the opposite actually, but it's interesting nonetheless. So we did, I think 7 parts on the Fort Worth Missing Trio just this past December. But yeah, that's probably where I'd recommend starting. It's an interesting story with a lot to it. So,
Mm-hmm. And Kate, I know that's a difficult question for you because it is a series, and you've got 2 more coming in January. Do you think we should just start out at the beginning?
Yeah, I think, we just started in November, so it would be season 1, I think, of Tenfold, which is, the way Tenfold works is it's 3 seasons per year of that show, 6 episodes per season. So it's 3 seasons starting, I think, season 1 is the most logical place. Same thing for Wicked Words, which is an interview series where I interview true crime writers and authors. Catherine Ramsland is a great place to start. She spent years in interviewing BTK in prison, and she's a forensic psychologist, and it just sort of goes from there. Most of those stories, both Tenfold More Wicked and Wicked Words are the majority are stories that most people have never heard of, true crime stuff, because it's, some of it's older.
And as somebody was mentioning in the chat earlier, it's so nice to be able to explore all of these shows because we can find out things that sort of like Vincent was mentioning that are more regional that we kind of assume everybody knows, but not everybody does if you're not from there necessarily. So Brandy, how about a good place to start for your show?
So while you were asking everyone else's question, I was trying to think of where, and I kind of like season 3, episode 5, which is about the murder of Kendra Hatcher, who was a dentist here in Dallas, a pediatric dentist who was stalked. I think the title is called Stalking Innocence. And the reason I felt like this was such a powerful one to do and just to cover in general was because she literally had no idea she was being basically hunted and stalked and watched, and then ultimately taken, her life is taken in her own apartment garage. But that's a good one to start with. And I actually just interviewed the Texas Ranger who had a big hand in solving the Mary Catherine Edwards case. So we just released that one last week. His interview is part 2. So you can start with part 1 of the Mary Catherine Edwards and then really listen to him kind of dive into the case and, what it entailed, the collaboration effort between Othram, the Beaumont Police Department, and the Texas Rangers for solving this case. So that's a really good one. But I feel like Kendra Hatcher could be any of us. And it really just kind of stuck with me. So that's the first one that came to mind.
Mm-hmm. And Texas 1031, I don't think I asked you guys yet.
I would suggest starting with episode, I think it's 46. Very similar, Whitney. We sucked it up big time till about, I don't know, episode 12, 13, something like that. Did the
totally
kitchen.
Understandable.
Yeah. But 46 is good. Cassie covers the murder of Melissa Trotter. Crazy judicial system process in the aftermath and trial.
Yeah.
The guy got executed just recently, and it's pretty baffling the stuff he was killed for over evidence-wise. And then I cover the murder or disappearance and alleged murder of Kelly Wilson up in Gilmer, and there's satanic ritual abuse. There's a family of raped children. There's sacrifice, missing people. It's a trip. So that's my answer.
Yep, well, that's a good one. And then mine is episode 13. It's Angie Samoda and Jeffrey Wright. Jeffrey Wright in particular, Hannah and I would text for days after it, just well, wait, but why did this happen? And what about this? So that was pretty wild.
It's his wife, Susan,
murdered him.
She just got out too.
Yeah, we think he might have been abusive. We don't know. There's a lot of speculation with that one. And then Angie is just kind of similar. She could be any one of us. Yeah. So
I think it's so interesting that so many of us respond to the same kind of thing, that the idea of just wrong place, wrong time. This concept of I had no idea and there would be no way for me to know. And a lot of these crazy details that we learn. Question to start with from Michael. Have you had one of these stories, and again, I kind of know which one I'm thinking of, that is so unbelievable you cannot believe that this actually has the true part to true crime?
Well, I would love to hear your thoughts on it first, because I do have a couple of answers, but
and I know I think I'm going to
it.
get this wrong, but is it the Pill Lake or the do you know what I'm talking about?
Yeah, the Lake City Quiet Pills.
Yes.
Yeah, that's like that's kind of like the weird area where conspiracy and true crime intersect, and it's a story about, I don't know. There was a message board basically on a website, and someone checked the code of it and found all these secret messages, and they happened to correlate to when a foreign diplomat was basically assassinated. So it's kind of like this weird conspiracy. It's hard to explain in a paragraph. So I'd recommend everyone just go check it out if you're interested. Yeah, that's definitely one of them. Another one that I still have trouble wrapping my head around is the Amerithrax, the 2001 anthrax letters. That was a super in-depth episode of my podcast that I covered. It's still crazy to think that story, is in national headlines for weeks, maybe months. And, the resolution of it is still very uncertain. But yeah, I don't know. For me, it's hard to separate what I know about these stories from, the facts. And I don't know. For me, it's pretty much every story. I have a hard time believing that it actually happened.
That's a good point.
Mm-hmm.
Does anybody else have an example that they can think of?
Yeah, so I did one called The Murder Pact of Roanoke, and it was between teenagers. They ended up killing their mother, who worked 2 jobs and basically did everything she could to give her kids everything she wanted, and in return, they decided to murder her. And I've done a few of these, the matricide, which is a very, it's not common for children to kill their own parents, but it's very interesting to think about the dynamic of I always say we don't know what goes on behind closed doors. We don't actually ever know, what is said, but it's interesting to see a child's mind working as an adult when they're in that decision making to take the life of a parent. And it's baffling. I covered another one about a child who basically killed his parents because he got in trouble at Six Flags, and he went home, and he was a star athlete. He grew up in a very expensive private school here in Dallas. And he basically killed his parents because he got in trouble because of what happened at Six Flags. But then he would come out and say he actually was, bullied by his father. And there were other reasons, but he got on his bicycle after killing his parents with a shotgun and rode his bike 4 miles to Addison, and then told an Addison police officer he had just killed his parents. So it's really interesting. I don't know, as children, how they're able to make these decisions, what they're supposed to do next, and what makes you go and grab your father's rifle and wait for your parents to come home. That's it.
Yes, please. Yeah.
So it's not really the crime itself, which is still horrific, but it was more the aftermath of everything. It was in the 80s. I covered a case about the Texas slave ranch in Mountain Home. And it was essentially this ranch where this multi-generational family would hire these transient workers, migrant farmers, whatever, and they would abuse and torture and inevitably murder them. There were recordings of it. There was weapons found at the ranch, human remains, but they were basically given less than a slap on the wrist and were sent home and let off, and nothing happened. So I think that to me was, crimes are obviously shocking, but like the fact that can happen, nothing essentially was shocking.
Yeah.
That is incredibly shocking. Do you feel like
It
the
happens all the time.
disconnect between the actual victims are, who is considered to
Yeah, I
be
mean, the
of
back
value?
cousin of the serial killer with sex workers, you know what I mean?
Yeah,
It's
the less
the
dead.
ranchers pick these victims and for a specific reason.
Yeah.
But yeah.
Oh my goodness. Vincent, do you have one of those stories as well?
Yeah, a lot
Oh,
of them. We
yeah,
did
sorry.
we did Kelly Day Wilson too. That one was particularly kind of unbelievable. That anything satanic panic is unbelievable. But we're working on one now that is it's a bunch of connected Houston like socialites, like high society types. It led us to like our first outside of Texas murder of a Texan outside of Texas, but involves Candy Mossler. I don't know. I would assume a lot of y'all know who that is.
I don't, sorry.
No, that's okay.
Or I may if you, I may, but
She
not know to know.
she was accused and put on trial along with her nephew lover of murdering her husband, who was a multimillionaire. They lived in Houston in a mansion in Houston, but he was murdered in his apartment in Florida, stabbed, kind of an overkill thing, like 39 times, I believe. That was in 68, 64. They went on trial in 66. But anyway, long story short, they had Percy Foreman as their attorney. So, needless to say, they got off. Everybody who has him gets off, it seems like. So anyway, she's connected. We kind of did some episodes about a preface. She wasn't our main story. He's a guy out of Houston, guy known as the Jackie Gleason of Houston, and there's several unsolved murders surrounding him and potential mob figures, and I don't know. It's a movie. It's like a movie.
Right.
So I don't know. Is that me? Did y'all hear that?
Mm-mm.
Sorry.
No.
I've got something coming through my headphones
Oh.
somehow.
think maybe it was just me
yeah.
making noise into my hand. Sorry, everybody.
Anyway, yeah, that's one of the. I'll use that one because
Okay.
we've got so many that are kind of unbelievable.
Yeah.
But
Yep.
It's hard to choose.
Now, I'll just refresh for anybody who wasn't in the first panel with Kate. I'd asked, what crime would you personally like to solve? And then separately of that, what crime would you just like to see solved? And so we were chatting with Kate. Kate was, mentioning JonBenet Ramsey would be quite, high on the list. And what else did I miss, Kate, before we turn it over to everybody else?
I mentioned the Colonial Parkway murders,
Right.
just because it affected so many people, 4 couples in 2 or 3 years in Virginia, the serial killer. And it's unusual. That's unusual. Somebody who kills couples, and we're pretty sure it's one person. So I think that with some DNA or some forensic genealogy, they could probably solve that one.
Mm-hmm.
And I think, here in Austin, the historical case of the Midnight Assassin, the Serpent Girl Annihilator from the 1800s, I think would be really interesting.
And of course, I'm not allowing anybody to say Zodiac because that would be, high on my list. So anybody else, you get to be the crime solver. You get to figure out who did what, and then what crime do you just want to see the answer to?
So
Okay.
I definitely, like myself, I got really I covered Sandra Bland in one of our episodes. We don't know what happened to her. There's no way we do. So I would love to somehow stumble into like uncovering what they did to her. But the one I kind of went a different direction with See Solved Period. Dean Corll, the Houston Candyman, who was taking young boys off of the streets in the Heights, his mass grave, they had to stop digging because it was just one big mass mess. And so I wish there was a way for them to continue digging, find the remaining people, because there's definitely more. So God, I would love for that to those victims to get their proper justice.
Yeah. Identification is such a huge deal. Yeah.
I chose for the Just Seeing Solved Period as the I think you pronounce it Miyazawa family massacre in Japan.
Mm-hmm.
That is just the most ridiculous case. It should be solved. There's so much physical evidence, DNA, description, ancestral history. Like it should be solved, and I don't want to be responsible for that. That's a lot, but it's completely solvable. So that would be my choice.
Yes, but I think correct me if I'm wrong, where it sort of stands now is there are too many interests in possibly not solving it. Is it that kind of?
Yep,
I've got that right. Yeah, Michael, how about you?
Personally, the stories that I would like to help solve. For me, I'm always interested in the stories that are kind of forgotten about, the stories that no one really ever mentions on the news. And some of the stories that I've kind of become the most obsessed with. There was one disappearance that I covered on my podcast, a man named Chip Campbell who disappeared in Florida. And he just kind of like went off the grid. He was exhibiting some bizarre behavior before he disappeared. And when I was making the episode, I got to talk to a lot of his family members and a lot of his friends. And it painted the portrait of someone who was a really good person and just kind of got down the wrong path for a short period in his life. And for me, that's one that I would love to see get some resolution. It seemed like he was just like a good guy who just had a bad month or something. And for me, that's one I would love to see just for his family, just to figure out what happened.
Mm-hmm.
But personally, the ones that I would love to see solved, period, are the ones with, the mass casualty incidents. I know in Texas, you guys have the Austin yogurt shop murders.
Yes.
That's one that I covered on my podcast. And that's one that I think that, we might not have the DNA testing available to solve it right now, but in 5 years, things progress so quickly. Maybe there's going to be some advancement. They'll be able to figure something out. Another one, the Colonial Parkway murders, which Kate mentioned. That's another big one that I would hope that there would be some hope of finding a resolution. Just someone who picks off couples in these isolated areas. that's terrifying, and also I would hope that they would be at least somewhat sloppy. But
Something,
Yeah.
yeah. And Brandy, I know you were ready to jump in.
So the one I would like to be a part of solving is Missy Beavers. I would like to know who is under that tactical gear. I think it's very solvable. I think it will be solved. It's just such a targeted crime that I wish we knew everything that they know. I wish we all knew what the police really do know. I mean, the crime was caught on tape. It's just a really, as a mom, and she was a mom, very close to my age, and I've been to Camp Gladiator. I've got up at 5 a.m. to go work out with friends, and it's really just scary and frightening knowing that could be, again, any of us. I would really like to be a part of that, or just to see it solved. Yogurt Shop Murders is another one. The Lane Bryant murders is another one.
Mm-hmm.
That's still up in the air on whether they think it was a man or a woman. They don't know. Yeah, there's quite a few. There's lots out there that need a good solve. So
It's
those
true.
are the ones that come to- John Benet Ramsey. So once a month, I do a Zoom with my listeners. So on the very last Thursday of the month, we talk about. So I do Texas crime. We choose something outside of Texas to talk about, something that's made national news. So we all get on together, and it's just like an open forum discussion about the case. We're doing the Golden State Killer this month. We did John Benet a couple of months ago. John Benet is such a, again, Kate mentioned, it's such a case that people want to see solved. Just so many questions, so many theories, and you could go down a total rabbit hole with that one. So seeing that come of a resolution would be nice.
And Whitney, last but not least.
Yes. So once a quarter, what we do on our podcast is Melissa and I travel to locations where people have gone missing or murdered. We have been to San Angelo, Texas, where Brandon Lawson went missing from the side of a highway. Nothing was ever found but his truck. He called 911. If you've listened to the 911 call, it's heartbreaking and terrifying. Yeah. And we meet with family members and close loved ones and do whatever they're needing to help further the case or get word out about it. So that's one that I would love to personally assist with. That was our first deep dive. Our second, we did Karen Bodine. She was murdered 15 years ago. Her body was also found on the side of the road. And that one is very, very close to being solved. So I would love either of those to assist with those. And we met Kelsey German at CrimeCon this year, and we've really developed a relationship with her. And if we could do anything to help with Delphi, and it's getting closer and closer every single day. That one's, especially Melissa, that's one near and dear to Melissa's heart. She's studied every inch of every information of that case, and that's one we would really like to see
And
resolved.
Delphi got mentioned in the chat as well.
Yes.
So yeah, and so speaking of all of this, I want to ask Kate this first. We've talked about this possibility of, okay, we may not have the technology right now, but 1 year, 5 years, whatever. What, forensically speaking, do you think, outside of the ones that we've mentioned, that there is a case that eventually somehow it's got the best chance of being solved?
I'm not sure. I think Yogurt Shop maybe. The issue with Yogurt Shop is that there was so much water from the firefighters going in, it destroyed a lot of the evidence. So I think my uncle was the head of SWAT for Austin PD at the time, and we talked about that. So, it's really hard. So much of it depends on, with the evidence that's collected, where it's collected, who does the collection, what the quality is. So, I would love to be able to say that forensic genealogy can solve Jean Benet or a lot of these cases that we're talking about. It's just so much a matter of what lab did they use? What technique did they use? There was a case that actually I mentioned in one of my books, talking about the fallibility of DNA evidence. about a man who was it was in the 70s, and there were two different women found on a California beach 2 or 3 years apart, both dead. And they linked it to a CSI investigator, an examiner, and through DNA evidence. And he was never arrested, but he was under scrutiny, and he ended up dying by suicide. Well, it turns out the reason that he was linked is because at that time period, it was in the 80s, when they were collecting DNA evidence and they were trying to, in the 80s or 90s, trying to run tests, they were using their own semen in these labs. So that's cross-contamination. And so that is the issue, is that, in wrongful conviction, we have to say that there has to be new evidence that wasn't available in order for somebody to be exonerated. And, just because we have DNA in a lot of these cases doesn't mean it's going to be enough or high enough quality, or, as a couple of people have said, that the technology is up and running yet. I think that forensic genealogy is huge. So I think that in some ways might be even more reliable than any DNA evidence. I mean, there's so many cases out there, particularly involving kids, that I think it would be really interesting to see where they go.
And I want to talk about forensic genealogy in just a second, but something that you said, Kate, made me think about this. When we talk about a case like JonBenet, for example, where at this point, a number of the key players are not with us anymore.
Right.
Either people who would be pushing for a resolution or people who may fear a resolution. How do you think that changes the case or the impetus behind it, or is something like that just grown so big that it doesn't matter 100 years from now, people still might want to know the answer?
Well, I think eventually some of these cases reach the Jack the Ripper status, which is, it's so ingrained in our culture. I mean, nobody really wants to know who Jack the Ripper is. No one. I promise. If you think about it, you really actually don't want to know. This is the most mythological figure in true crime history. I don't want to know who he is.
It could be nothing but a letdown unless it was, in fact, the case.
It will be. Yeah, it will be. I think even then it'll be a letdown, because you're picturing, I mentioned in one of my books that when we invoke the image of Jack the Ripper, it is often of fog-filled streets and gas lamps in London. And not one of the nights that he killed was there any fog at all. So it is just this, this allure of Jack the Ripper. And honestly, I think JonBenet, in a weird way, is reaching kind of that status where it's just going to be a mystery that maybe we really want to stay a mystery. It's one of those enduring things, which is interesting to contrast it to someone like Madeleine McCann, where things are moving really quickly. And I didn't think anything was going to move on that case ever. And they are. So I don't know. I mean, I think there's hope for every case, but I do think that, obviously the older that these cases get, maybe there's not that much less interest, but you've got more police who are dying and things are getting lost and contaminated. And, I never underestimate the ability of something within evidence that's supposed to be preserved well, not be preserved well. And then you're banking on, this knowledge that they took DNA evidence. That doesn't always, do the trick. So I'm always a negative Nelly about stuff like that, though. So.
And anyone else, please feel free to jump in. We were talking about, forensically speaking, what do you think something big has a real possibility of going the distance?
Personally, I think the Long Island serial killer. I think there is probably a lot of evidence that investigators have withheld, and I wouldn't be surprised to see movement in that in the near future. I know it seems like a bit of a long shot, but a lot of people said that, the Golden State Killer was never going to be solved. But I told them, there's a shot, just let the investigators, let's give them a beat. Let's see what they could do. And I think the recent overhauling of Long Island, the Suffolk County Sheriff's Department, I think we could see some progress up there.
It's interesting. And Kate had mentioned something earlier during our first panel too, about what happens when regimes change. Sometimes somebody really wants to make a statement, and so then DNA kits get tested finally, or whatever.
And also during re-elections, that happens
Mhm.
all the time. Prosecutions, when the DA is up for re-election, that happens a lot.
So, Kate, you're telling me that there are political motivations
I know, I
behind
can't
this
believe
stuff?
it myself.
I think it's
But-
also interesting that it doesn't even have to be at that level of conspiracy. I mean, just
Right.
base level relationships change, and some guy dated some girl, or some sex worker had some pimp or girlfriend or sister, and it's like, well, they're not in my life anymore. I'll go tell you the truth. So it just takes something even that small.
hmm Just time, and finally, the one person will say the thing that everybody's been waiting for. Well, so I would love to get into forensic genealogy because it's something that I'm completely fascinated with. My great aunt was an amateur genealogist, and now, of course, in libraries, it's a big thing. And at the time that I was a kid in the 70s and 80s, that was the huge resurgence of genealogy. And I actually did, sorry, I randomly did a paper on this, and you can base it back to Roots, the book and the TV miniseries, and it's about giving names to people who didn't have names. And so everything that has flown really out of that movement. And now, of course, I think most of us really didn't know the concept until Golden State Killer. And now it's something that we talk about all of the time. Now, having said that, though, it's changed the landscape of forensic investigation. I don't think I'm overstating the impact of it, but it's so widespread. And like with so many of those things, legislation is not caught up to it yet. Privacy laws, people's thinking about it, we're all sort of in different steps with that. So starting back with Gone Cold, where do you, if you don't mind sharing, where do you stand on forensic genealogy? Valuable tool, slippery slope of privacy issues, somewhere in between neither of those things?
I mean, it's hard to say. I don't think it's a slippery slope. I think as long as it's handled the way it's been handled, now you can opt out of GEDmatch. Companies like Authram, they have their own database. Well, you have to put your stuff in there. It's right up front. It's used for law enforcement. I don't know. Now there's privacy laws coming about trash on the curb. I get that a little bit more. Um, I find no problem with genetic genealogy. I've got no issues with it.
Mm-hmm. And do you think that's indicative of the real stakes that you see, the real lives affected, the real people involved, as opposed to, more of a kind of theoretical legal medical rights question?
I think that's a good point. I mean, I've talked with family members on almost every case. So, yeah, I mean, these are people in pain, like sometimes for decades. Yeah, I definitely see it more from their perspective. But at the same time, I also feel, my DNA is in these databases. I feel I don't have anything to hide.
Mhm.
So I don't know. I don't feel like it's an invasion of privacy if your cousin, third cousin or whatever happens to link you to a murder or a rape. Well, I mean, that's your problem. You shouldn't have raped someone or killed someone. So, I mean, I don't know about the legal issues. I know there's a lot of ethical issues behind DNA concerning like medical issues, disease, family diseases and stuff like that. And that's cool, but that's not a part of what genetic genealogy does. So I just don't have a problem. And yes, you're right. I see it through, I don't really see it on a rights side.
Mhm.
on a constitutional side. I see it on the victim's family side. So maybe I'm biased. I don't know.
And Texas 1031, I wondered if you guys had an opinion about it.
I total agreement. If you murder someone, I think you kind of, it's okay that we kind of, we get your DNA in a way that's a little bit more shrouded and I don't know.
Roundabout. Yeah.
Yeah. The Golden State Killer wouldn't have been caught if it wasn't for some random family member they never knew of. So who cares? You know, yeah.
And I think that I've never submitted my DNA to any of these companies or websites, organizations, whatever, but I'm pretty sure there's the, sign here, agree here to these terms. So it's like you accepted that, you're aware. I don't know. I think that Vincent made a good point of like medical stuff and like your medical history and you as a person, but like I feel like this is same concept, different like avenue. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Like I get it, and privacy is always going to be an issue, but I think everyone needs to get over it, because if your significant other or your child or whomever, your parent, was murdered and this was a way to catch the person, like you would totally be okay with it.
Yeah.
Like that's
how it needs
obvious.
to be looked at, for sure.
Yeah, it's really difficult because, difficult is not the right word, but you can understand people saying that as a victim, I've lost my privacy. So, where were my rights in this? And that then legally speaking, it can be a place of privilege to try to assert a third person right to, genetic information that was not uploaded by you, as opposed to everyone else who's been victimized. But Whitney, wondering what you think. And Julie's got an interesting question. Well, after Whitney gets a chance.
Honestly, I'm in the same line as Vincent and Texas 1031. I mean, if you, coming from the victim standpoint, if someone is out there that murdered my family member or my loved one, I would want to know. And if a family member of theirs opted in to give their DNA, then there it is, luck's not on your side at that point. As far as the medical standpoint, I wouldn't want people to know my medical history out there in the general public, but I don't think this is the question that we're being asked. We're not asking for medical history. We're asking if someone in your family has murdered someone. And it's important for the victims and the cases to have them closed.
Mm-hmm. And from a medical standpoint, sorry, I'm looking at the chat at the same time, that there's still some debate about, is our DNA essentially, do we have a right to privacy to our DNA? Is it our most basic medical information? And it's not a simple question to answer, but I wanted to throw in here a couple of comments from the chat. So Julie was asking on the other side, what about when there are errors? And we've talked about that with Kate in terms of unreliability of some of this evidence. Sir Night Night was saying criminal consented to give his DNA when he committed the crime. Fair game at that point. Tracy was saying that several jurisdictions have put limitations on how to collect this information, like what we were mentioning with Vincent and some other folks talking about opting out of submitting your information to certain sites, but also, and this is something that we see in libraries, requiring warrants in order to access information, which is a very big deal. And so, Kate, I'm sorry, there's a lot to throw out at you, wondering what you think based on your experience, including with the Innocence Project.
Yeah, I mean, I have zero problem with using DNA to solve crimes. I just that there's not even a debate for me as far as privacy goes. And again, it's not being surreptitiously gathered without your consent. You are giving consent, to have your DNA out floating about in the system. So I think that
by the commission of a crime.
Yeah, and well, I think that I was looking at Julie's comment about what happens when there are errors, and that's what we were talking about in the panel, the authors panel, which is, my book is about forensics. And that's why, yet again, we come back to that should not be the only piece of evidence against a person. There has to be more than that. So you cannot rely solely on, a JED match or whatever. There has to be, you then have to have dogged investigators who are going to do the footwork to then let's get a preponderance of evidence. Where was he? Was cell phone records available back then? Are there financial records? Like, what is the circumstantial case that you can build? I think when things get tricky with anything that has to do with DNA is if you rely on it solely and that's it. That's the only piece of evidence that you have against someone. Then a good defense attorney can come in and poke holes in basically every lab in the country has had some kind of an issue. And if it's not a lab, it's the crime scene collection people who have gone in. Somebody has had a problem with chain of custody with this evidence somewhere down the line. And that's why you need more than just that. So, I'm glad that she made that comment because I think it's interesting to know that this is not the end all be all. It's a starting point when you're using DNA and forensic genealogy, but it shouldn't be the end of the road for that investigation.
Mm-hmm. And Michael, any thoughts on any of that?
Yeah. I'm not necessarily going to be a dissenting voice, but I think that I do kind of split the difference in the middle. I do agree with genetic genealogy. I mean, after all, the first story that I covered was the Golden State Killer, and I'm insanely happy that SOB was caught. But I think that we do need to. Also a big fan of privacy laws, and I feel like in America, a lot of our privacy laws have kind of been wilted away over the years. So I do think that
or if we ever had them.
Yeah.
Especially when it comes to our data, for example.
Yeah, I'm primarily thinking of like digital privacy, but yeah, I think there needs to be some sort of standard because at the end of the day, DNA is circumstantial evidence. It can be a smoking gun, but it's not the be all end all of a criminal case. Kind of like what Kate was saying. There needs to be, an alibi. There needs to be other evidence pointing towards a specific suspect. And I've covered several cases where someone has been linked through DNA, but they were later acquitted or, their ruling was overturned. There's so many different, examples I could give, but I do think that genetic genealogy is a really good thing. I would just like to see it be more, codified. It seems like right now there's just a lot of law enforcement agencies that are just kind of doing their own thing. So I think there needs to be more of a kind of a standard on what's allowed, what's not allowed. And I think that would help in the future with any potential court hearings. Because I would hate to see, like the Golden State Killer, his conviction later be overturned on some privacy snafu. So that's kind of where I stand, but I am a big fan of it.
Speaking of standards, I know personally what I would like to see happen, especially when we talk about rape and sexual violence, that those things don't tend to stop. There's no reason for it to stop. And when you cross state lines, especially less so these days, but you can lose victims, you can lose perpetrators, that there isn't enough of a standard in terms of testing regardless of the crime, but especially for certain crimes. Does anybody, that's kind of a vague question, does anybody else have something you would really like to see codified, something standardized, so that just because you committed in Missouri and then Arkansas later on, we didn't find you for 35 years or whatever?
Yeah, I'll kind of jump into that. I do think that there needs to be a lot more testing of rape kits and sexual assault kits. I've covered some stories from Oklahoma, and when I was doing research, I was shocked to find out that there are thousands of rape kits from just the state of Oklahoma alone that have gone untested. And, that all of the people that went, unidentified after committing those crimes, what other crimes did they commit? It's kind of like this snowball effect of, criminals getting away with it and then being emboldened. So I think that as a country, we need to do a lot more to dedicate resources towards that sort of thing.
Mhm.
I can add something if that's all right.
Thank you, please.
Speaking on what Michael said, I think a bigger issue is not obviously the backlog, but the issue behind that is forensic labs need to be separated from law enforcement agencies 100%. They're predominantly testing or not testing it, rather, evidence, and whether it's blood, semen, hair, tissue, whatever, storing it for police cases solely. And if they are separated and they don't have that bias and they don't have that, hey, you're my buddy at the lab, don't test this or do test that, or go ahead and chuck this over in the trash. It truly happens. Read, and there's a number of literature out there that you can read how this stuff works out. And I think that because there is no funding towards forensic labs, then that in turn doesn't incentivize anyone to want to go work there, which then just keeps the backlog, and it domino effects everywhere else. And that's something that should be seriously considered when moving forward in criminal justice, like just the future of it, of separating the law enforcement from actual crime labs.
Yeah.
And speaking of your experience in criminal justice, would you also say that standards for training,
Oh yeah,
something
I mean,
like that?
I'm pretty sure up to at least 2015, there was no set rules of what you had to put in a report as a evidence technician. Like,
God.
there wasn't any, like, you didn't have to put dates, times, anything. There was no standard, essentially. And that's why there's so much corruption, and that's why there is so much error, like Julie had stated in her chat, that like, what about error? Well, it's a high possibility because of like, there is no set sort of rhyme or reason of how things work. It's upsetting, to say the least.
Yeah.
And Tracy in our chat jumped in a second ago to say, sexual assault nurse examiner here in the house, national standards are being worked on. Thank you, Tracy. Very, very interesting to know.
And I just want to chime in 1 second. We're
Please.
talking about DNA and genealogy and solving cases. I just covered one about an 11-year-old girl that was taken from a motel. She had only been in the United States less than a month. Her family had moved here from England, but they actually found her killer recently. He's deceased, passed away, but they did it by phenotyping. So they had his DNA, but they didn't know anything about him. And they basically did an age progression from 25, 45 to 65 to see what he would look like. And so based on that, they found distant cousins, ended up identifying someone. But just talking to some Texas Rangers recently, you would be surprised when you have these cases that have been unsolved for 30, 40, 50, 60 years. Pecos Jane Doe is another one. Texas Monthly just came out with an article about this, but a woman had drowned in Pecos, Texas at the Ropers Motel. She was found at the bottom of the pool. Very interesting, but she was just identified after, 1966 is what I believe when they actually found her body. But sometimes you get pushback from families, especially when maybe maybe they're the ones that found their loved one, or maybe so much time has gone by, they don't want to have to face that again, right? They've kind of healed and gone through their stages of grief and have closed a door to that. And so it's like reopening. And I know we all think like every family member wants answers, but surprisingly, that's not always the case. So I think too, it's getting the family on board, really, and which cannot, and it isn't always easy, believe it or not. So I think really just having a mutual beneficial agreement between, and I think because every state is independent, like Texas, right? So you have certain police departments that do things a certain way, and then you have the Texas Rangers who come in and do things a certain way, and then you're trying to, coordinate that police department with how they're working together. So I think it is kind of a free-for-all right now. I think that some police departments don't want other people involved. I think they want to keep, those cases close to them. Maybe they've put, 10 10, 20, 30 years, had different detectives on this trying to solve it, and they want to keep that close to heart. So I think it's a fantastic thing. I think we're getting lots of answers from cases that are really, really old, and we really want to see things solved. But as a person who is not involved, I don't have a family member missing. I don't have someone who is deceased. So as an outsider, I want families to have answers. But surprisingly, that's not always the case.
Mm-hmm. Very interesting, Brandy. And Julie, what were you submitting in the chat? Zelda said, how to fix a drug scandal was mind-blowing. So something for us to check out.
Yeah, that's a really good docuseries on Netflix. It's about how a lab that was testing all of these like drug samples and stuff ended up being corrupt. I don't want to spoil it, but everyone should go check it out.
Yeah. And Whitney, I'm sorry, didn't mean to overlook you. Any other thoughts on?
No, I mean, I think everyone has kind of hit the nail on the head. I don't know what more I could add that hasn't already been said.
Absolutely.
Everyone's got these great points, and it's interesting to see everyone's different opinion and how it's a little bit different, but we're all kind of on the same path trying to get to the same ending of solving some of these cases, and really just we're all on the same train trying to get to the same result.
Well, and speaking of, and nobody has to answer this question if it doesn't apply to you, but just wondering, talking about being on this path and so much of this work that you have done, speaking directly with victims and family members, is there something that you feel especially proud of in the course of this work that you've done on the show, exploring the world of true crime, that you wouldn't mind sharing with us?
I can start. I don't know that I would consider it as a proud moment, but when we started this podcast, it was something that we originally saw as a hobby, as this is something where we are talking about true crime anyway. Let's record it, even if only my mom and Melissa's sisters listen to it. Who cares? Like, we had no purpose in this. And we've only been a podcast since September. I mean, we're very young in the podcast world, and we have grown so much individually, and now we've developed a passion and a purpose and a mission, and now we won't stop until we can help get some sort of answers for some of these family members that we have met and some of these cases we have covered. We have created something that we hope can help the world.
Thank you, Whitney.
Yeah,
Brandy.
I'm kind of like what Whitney was saying. We started Texas Wine and True Crime in October of last year. And I just wanted to talk about true crime because I love storytelling. And I wanted to just share my passion for wine. And it sort of has taken on this animal of its own. And I've been doing live shows at wineries and in different cities in Texas. And being able to interview a Texas Ranger, then I'm all of a sudden in a text message with like 7 Texas Rangers. And it sort of has taken this life of its own, which I'm really happy about, really passionate about. And so it's in talking to family members, meeting people at CrimeCon, meeting family members, meeting the guys over at Othram, what all the great things they're doing. And it really is just, it has opened up my world of true crime. And I'm feeling pretty blessed to have been able to be here, right? To Erica reaching out and just,
thank you.
So it's like this small little, I always say podcasting can be a lonely world, but it's also a very, you're sort of sitting there talking, you feel like sometimes to yourself, even though there's people listening to you, right? You're behind a microphone. But I think we're all just sort of like on the same path to give families answers, to shed light on things that are forgotten and people who are forgotten. And for me, that's the most important thing, is that everyone matters. And it's important to, that's why I like picking cases sometimes in Texas people don't know, or maybe people they haven't heard of, because there's just so much of it. And it really is just being able to meet family members, talk to people directly involved with these cases. And it just makes you feel really good that you're doing something really good. So
Podcasters are the best. I'm going to throw out I'm also a podcaster, not in the true crime space, but yeah, podcasters are the best.
Yeah.
Speaking of Texas 1031, you guys were going to jump in there.
Oh, all I was gonna say was that we made no effort to really put ourselves out there as a podcast. Like I started the podcast as sort of like, when I would listen to podcasts, they would give their opinion and that was it. And I kept wanting, what do you think about it? Or excuse me, they would give the facts, but not their opinion. And I always was like, well, I want to hear what you think. Like, don't you have like some thoughts on this? So that's why I was like, well, I'm going to tell the story how I want to tell it and give my 2 cents. And then I broadcasting on whatever, but like episode 3. But I don't remember what my point was of it. Like we didn't get sponsors. We're not on a network. We didn't, this is true hobby. Like both Brandy and Whitney said, it's just something we wanted to do. And so when you, just to harp on the same thing of like, we were in the Houston Chronicle, which was really cool.
Yeah.
I got to be on a TV show recently that'll be coming out next year. And like, those are all cool things. But when you get that message from a cousin or a sister and you're like, holy shit. Oh, sorry.
It's okay.
This is like a person that knows and is thanking you or, giving you a critique even of what you said. That means the best or the most, because you're like, wow, actually this means something now. It isn't just talking to yourself.
Yeah.
It really went further than that. And that's cool.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. And that's all, like both of us, I think we try to just, like Brandy was just saying, like shed light on victims, people, human beings that like maybe you've never heard about, they've never been talked about.
Mm-hmm.
And I
not to negate the ones that have been talked about.
Of course. But I would love, I very much doubt that I'll ever be involved in helping solve something. That would be amazing. But at least their names are said again. And that's the big thing for us.
Absolutely. And Michael.
Yeah, I was about to jump on that. Kind of the same thing. I started my podcast just wanting to cover stories, like I said, that weren't getting coverage elsewhere. And one of the biggest compliments I'll ever get is when people will email me or something and say, like, I never heard about this case. Thank you for shedding light on it. And especially when I talk to a family member or, someone involved with a case and they say, thank you for taking the time to cover this. Like, for me, that makes it all worth it. And like Vince was saying at the beginning, like true crime can be very heavy, especially when you're talking to family members and loved ones. And personally, I'm not a big like true crime fanatic anymore, just because I have a hard time separating, like the work from what I used to enjoy. But yeah, just getting to cover these stories and, talking to loved ones and getting to shed light on a story that hasn't been covered in, 9-10 years, like even if it's a bit soul crushing at times, it's rewarding in that you're getting to shed light on a story. So for me, that's the thing I'm most proud of for my podcast.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. And Vincent or Kate, before we turn it over to see if anybody else has any questions, anything you would like to pat yourself on the back for, or let us pat you on the back for?
Go ahead, Vincent.
No, you go ahead. It's okay.
Yeah, I mean, I think my show is a little different. The Tenfold More Wicked, we get into such a deep dive. It's 4.5 hours into one story with the interviews with the family members. And, what we bring up a lot is whatever the contemporary issue was then and how we draw it out now. So some of I think the nicer things that actually seemed to have a pretty larger impact was I had quite a few people from season 1 who listened to season 1 contact me about current domestic violence that they were experiencing, and 2 that said they actually left their husbands after listening to the first season. About Edward Ruloff, about a man who abused his husband 170 years ago. So history is very powerful depending on how you can tell it. And the second season, actually, felt gratifying too, was about Burke and Hare, which is probably the most well-known story I'll do. Serial killers in Scotland who killed 16 people, maybe 17, probably more, who knows.
Right.
So Burke and Hare, they were selling these bodies to an anatomy professor. And so when I'm in Scotland, I talk to the head of the anatomy school and we talk about the contemporary issue, which is that they don't have enough bodies. in anatomy schools. And I went to the Body Farm, which is at Texas State University, the largest body farm forensic anthropological site in the world. They don't have enough bodies either. And why is it important? Why is organ donation important? And I had quite a few people tell me they have now signed to donate their bodies to specific schools because there are body brokers who will happily take your body, pay your family for your body, and then they will ship your parts out to God knows where, and your family will never get them back. So this is like being able to bring out information, not just specifically about a crime, but about the issues that the crime shines a light on is as important to me as telling the story about the crime. So it's nice to see, the third episode was about mental health issues, why this kid killed his parents in Texas, in Austin in 1935. There was a lot of feedback about what the issues were, what people thought really was the real reason all of this stuff happened. So I think from a base level, aside from doing storytelling, what I like is to have conversations about these types of issues that you might not have thought of, but now all of a sudden you're sucked into a story and sort of in some ways force-fed something like who is really going to go to a party and a dinner party and talk about body donation. But a lot of people talked about it on social media because it's a big issue that it's just kind of easier to talk about when it's framed in the context of a true crime story. So that's sort of been my experience with nice feedback that I've gotten.
And by the way, Tracy gives a good recommendation, Stiff by Mary Roach. Mary Roach is awesome. If you've never heard of Mary Roach, check out Mary Roach. Great book that talks about what can happen to a body after death. And last but not least, Vincent, if you have something to share.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know if any feelings I have are pride. I don't know. But I've made a lot of friends, family members, like lifelong kind of stuff, from the cases we've covered, and people I talk to all the time. So I about their loved ones' cases or about their kid's birthday party or something. So it's that's it for me. That, and like Michael said, hearing somebody say thank you for covering this, I'm from that town, nobody's ever done it, it's hasn't been talked about in 20 years, whatever. That's particularly rewarding. When a case is solved that nobody was talking about, and when you started talking about it, that's about as close to pride as it gets.
Pretty amazing. Yeah.
Yeah. And I don't know if I'd call it pride, but it's like it feels good. So
gratifying. I think as Brandy was saying,
that's the right word, probably. So I don't know, that's what it is for me. Just doing the right thing. I think we're relatively ethical about how we approach things, and I think that's important. And I don't know.
Well,
that's my answer.
I'm gonna ask Kelly to speak for you a little bit. Kelly says, I'd like to pat Vincent on the back. He covered my cousin's case, which is super convoluted. It has been covered by many podcasters, but he is the only one that took literally years to dig in and really research and tell us as close to the truth as any of us can get. I'm very proud of the job he did, and the coverage on Carla Walker was extensive and surely helped in her case being solved. So, and Daphne says thank you as well.
Daphne, yes, she's another friend that I've made. Her cousin and her husband were killed. Horrible murder in Corpus Christi in '85. Axe murder. It's terrible. So
I would like to take a moment just to commend Vincent. His podcast series on Carla Walker, and I think the February slangs. It was one of the few podcast series that ever elicited like genuine tears from me. So I was at work listening to the podcast and I had to like shuffle off to the bathroom for a few minutes, but I would just like to really commend Gone Cold for the work they do. And I'm going to be checking out all these other podcasts when I
Yes.
have time.
And thank you, Michael, for
Thanks,
mentioning
man.
that. If everybody would take another moment, please, before we sign off for the day, and let us know again how we can find you, names of the shows, your names, just all of that good stuff one more time, please. Any order.
Yeah,
Go ahead,
gone,
Vincent.
thank you. I'm Vincent, Gone Cold podcast, Texas True Crime. You can find us Facebook, all the social medias, anywhere you listen to podcasts, like literally anywhere. I hope. So we're easy to find. I think we're the one with the Texas. There's other Gone
Yeah.
Colds.
Right here. If anybody can see my screen, I'm
Yeah,
waving my cursor around it.
right. There's other Gone Colds that came after us, but we're the one with the Texas. So easy to find.
Okay. Thank you, Vincent.
Thank you.
Brandy?
Yeah, so Texas Wine and True Crime, you can find us pretty much anywhere, I think. So just search Texas Wine and True Crime. We're the ones with the fingerprint and the wine glasses in front of it. We are on social media, Instagram, Facebook. Yeah, we do live shows. So I do announcements on where those shows are going to be. So if you follow us on our social media, you can find out where you can see us live. And we do have a website, texaswineandtruecrime.com. And I know we are running out of time, but we should also do Vincent, Michael, ladies, I would love to hear your take on when you do get emails from, okay, so like I got an inmate email from someone who had been incarcerated with the person I covered,
Oh, wow.
wanted to tell me things about that person that she personally learned being imprisoned with her. That was very interesting. You had to be very diplomatic, I think, answering back to those. But I'd like to hear some stories from you guys about that. But
And
that's
Kate
it.
should also tell us too, maybe how to handle that from a journalistic standpoint. Ethical standards.
Yeah.
Texas
so-
1031, do you want to show us your paper?
Yeah, so like our Instagram, it's Texas 1031 podcast, all spelled out, no numbers. And then we're on Facebook, all the things, we try to record when we can. We're trying to get back into it because we both got really busy with school and life and things. But there's a good 50 episodes, 51 now, that you can listen to. We're not safe for work. We curse a lot.
Okay.
I do want to say before we leave, Michael and Vincent, I'm a huge fan. Michael, I've been listening to you for a long time. Vincent, you were like a source for me when I covered Carmen Crone. So thank you.
Yeah, thanks everyone. Thanks for having me on this panel. It's been a lot of fun. And my podcast, Unresolved, can be found pretty much anywhere. Spotify, I don't know if Google's still around, Apple Podcast. If you can't stand my voice, I have all my transcripts available at my website, so you can read everything I work on. That's unresolved.me. But yeah, thanks again for everyone.
And congratulations on the new baby.
Oh, thank you.
Yes.
You're welcome.
Gonna go take care of her right after this.
And Whitney, thank you for joining us from the outdoors.
You're welcome. It is hot out here. But I'm going to throw our link tree into the chat because Cults,
Thank
Crimes,
you.
and Cabernet is a lot to type out. And that's all of our social media, our website, basically any information. If you're looking to find us, you'll find it there.
Great. Thank you, Whitney. And Kate, last but not least, thank you for doing 2 panels with us.
No problem. So Tenfold More Wicked and Wicked Words are both everywhere you can think of, and we're on social everywhere you can think of also.
And book 3 is coming out
Um,
soon-ish.
No. It'll be, let's see, this is 2021, probably January of 2023 when seasons 7, 8, and 9 come out of Tenfold More Wicked. So they'll coincide.
January 2023 is when Round Rock Public Library gets its new building. So
Cool.
do a ribbon cutting
Just-
ceremony for us.
We
Or
should have a joint party.
Yes, good plan. Well, everyone, thank you so much again to all of our podcasters, to everyone that came out to listen and participate and throw questions in the chat. We've so enjoyed ourselves. You made our first annual amazing. thank you. Hopefully the first of many more to come. So thank you to everyone. Everyone have a great day. Stay safe, stay sexy, all of that good stuff. And we will see you later. And our winners of our trivia contest, we will be in touch. Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.
Take care.
Bye. Take care, everyone.